History is full of facts, dates, names, treaties, wars. It is, by definition, a timeline of events that have happened, news to nobody. But just behind those facts is something messier. Countless sprawling alternatives that didn't happen. But few could have if a bullet had been fired a few inches to the left, a sweet and innocent child who grew up to condemn millions' death had died of a disease at age 2, or politicians voted one way and not the other. These tiny little fractures create pretty wild what-if moments that had the power to completely reshape the world and history as we know it. But of course, we've got no idea about any of it because it didn't happen. This isn't about the past we memorized in school. This is about the alternate timeline, some better, some worse, but all very much plausible. What if Kennedy had ducked? What if Hitler got into art school? What if the internet stayed locked in a Pentagon basement? Every one of these moments was a crossroads, but we never really think about these dramatic, epoch-altering signposts, do we? Every day, billions of decisions are made that could potentially change everything. So let's get back and take a look at 50 of history's biggest what-if moments. Just before we get into the video today, do you remember when people feared that AI would replace humans? What? Well, it's 2025 and it's kind of happening, isn't it? Amazon, JP Morgan, Ford, they're all cutting jobs. Microsoft could eliminate 36% of its workforce through AI automation. But here's the thing, you can flip that script. Instead of being replaced, you can lead the AI revolution. That's why I partner with Outskill to give you free access to their 2-day AI mastermind this very weekend. This normally costs $895, but Outskill, which is the world's biggest AI education platform, by the way, is giving you guys, that's my viewers, 1,000 free seats for the next 72 hours. 4 million people have already attended globally, and they're now using AI to get promotions and get those salary hikes that they deserve. You'll master prompt engineering, learn 10 powerful AI tools like Make.com and Claude. Claude's amazing. And build AI agents, automate your work, and create apps with AI. Whether you're in HR, marketing, sales, or running your own business, this is for you. So mark your calendars this Saturday and Sunday, 10 a.m. to 7 p.m. both days. Sign up now using my link and you'll get $5,000 worth of bonuses. Okay. Including a 3,000 plus prompt Bible, an AI money-making roadmap, and your personalized AI toolkit. Links in the description and the pinned comment. Grab your seat before it expires and join their WhatsApp community for updates. Now today's video. Adolf Hitler, for all his monstrous flaws, had some strength. He was a fine rabble-rouser and knew a thing or two about military tactics, but his art, certainly according to experts, was a bit shit. But let's rewind the clock back to 1907. We're in Vienna, and a 17-year-old Adolf Hitler with a head full of ambition and a sketchbook full of buildings walks nervously into the Academy of Fine Arts, but he's rejected twice. Now, let's imagine he's accepted, and his style and technique improve under the expert tutelage that he finds there. He's not a failed artist living in hostels, eating dry bread, stewing in resentment, and muttering about the Jews. Instead, he's painting cityscapes, maybe struggling, maybe even becoming a success. But most importantly, he had a purpose and meaning. Without rejection, there's no festering obsession with purity, nationalism, or betrayal. No conspiracy theories about Jews undermining society. No fixation on a mythologized Germany that was stabbed in the back. What you get is a frustrated artist, and there's always been plenty of those. What you don't get is a dictator. But it goes deeper than just one man's ego. Without Hitler, the Nazi Party either doesn't form or never gets out of the beer halls. Germany in the 20s was a mess, crippled by reparations, political chaos, and hyperinflation, and no doubt someone would have tried to ride that wave, but it's hard to imagine anyone pulling it off with the same combination of charisma, delusion, and timing that Hitler had. And if he's not there in 1933 to take power, the Weimar Republic might limp on longer. It probably doesn't solve Germany's problems overnight, but there's no sweeping purge of Jews, no Anschluss, no invasion of Poland, and definitely no Holocaust. 6 million lives are not snuffed out in a state-sponsored industrial murder machine. Without World War II, Europe wouldn't have burned again, and cities wouldn't have vanished under a carpet of bombs. The Soviet Union doesn't claw half a continent into its grasp, and America doesn't become a superpower by default. Japan doesn't bomb Pearl Harbor, which means no Pacific War, no Hiroshima, no Nagasaki, and no nuclear age, kicking off with a mushroom cloud. You also lose the Cold War era. There's no arms race, no Berlin Wall, no Cuban Missile Crisis, Vietnam, Korea. The second half of the 20th century suddenly flattens out, and it's as if everybody actually learned their lesson from the First World War. Back in Vienna, that quiet, slightly odd painter might have lived out his life unknown and died in his 70s with a few unremarkable canvases hanging in dusty cafes. just a footnote in history. A man who'd walk past in the street without a second thought. It's one of those forks in the American road, and your view of it may very much depend on your position in relation to the Mason-Dixon line. We all know what happened. After a titanic struggle, the North prevailed, preserving the Union, and Lincoln died for the cause. For those in the North, it was a triumph, but for those in the South, it was a complete disaster, and the irritation from it still lingers today. But imagine this. Gettysburg falls, General Lee takes Washington, the Union fractures, the Confederate States of America become a separate, recognized nation. So what then? First and foremost, obviously, slavery survives. The Confederacy was built on preserving slavery, not just economically, but ideologically. It was enshrined in their Constitution, so if they win, it doesn't end in 1865. It continues, likely for decades, maybe even longer. So now we have a United States and a Confederate States, side by side, one industrializing, the other clinging to plantations. Two governments, two currencies, two competing visions of what freedom means, and a constitution that they once shared, all of it on the same continent, glaring at each other across a new border that runs straight through the heart of what used to be one country. Tensions wouldn't just simmer, they would absolutely boil. The Confederacy would diplomatically be isolated in a world already starting to lean against slavery. European nations might have recognized it early, but over time support would fade, especially as abolition gained traction elsewhere. You end up with an American Cold War, not about nukes, but about race, territory, and ideology. There's also the knock-on effect globally. No strong United States means no early rise to global power. The Spanish-American War doesn't happen, which probably means a smaller land area, and the US entry into World War I is far less likely. And without that, the war drags on longer or ends differently. No unified America means no major allied force tipping the balance in either world war. Domestically, the North might still progress toward racial equality, but the South entrenches its caste system. Slavery may eventually transition into some kind of apartheid-like structure, but it would not vanish overnight, and certainly not under pressure from within. Generations would be born and die in bondage or under legalized segregation, and the civil rights movement might never even start. Economic divergence would also explode. With its factories and finance, the North pulls further ahead, while the South, stuck in an agrarian model propped up by forced labor, lags badly. Poverty spreads, class divides deepen, and resentment hardens. Eventually, maybe, there's another war. A second civil war fought decades later with newer weapons and even deeper scars. Or maybe the two Americas just drift further apart, one becoming a symbol of regression, while the other shoulders the weight of being the half that tried. Either way, if the South wins, America as we know it would never exist. There was no superpower, civil rights victory, or global leadership in the 20th century, just a fracture that never heals. It is one of history's biggest heartbreaks, a treasure trove of knowledge reduced to ash. The Library of Alexandria, founded in Egypt over 2,000 years ago, wasn't a building full of scrolls. It was the internet, the university, and the memory bank of the ancient world all rolled into one. Nobody knows exactly how much or even what was lost. Estimates say up to 400,000 scrolls on a huge array of subjects: maths, astronomy, medicine, history, philosophy. Some say Julius Caesar did it, while others blame religious zealots. But either way, if that library had survived, humanity's story would have taken a different turn. Let's start with science. The Greeks, Persians, and Egyptians had already mapped the stars with mind-blowing precision. They'd measured Earth's circumference, worked out heliocentrism, and dabbled in rudimentary evolutionary ideas. But then came the fire, and centuries of momentum stopped. It would take over 1,000 years for Europe to catch back up. Keep the library intact, and the Renaissance might have happened in the 300s instead of the 1400s. The Industrial Revolution, bump it forward several hundred years. Space exploration could have been kicking off in the 1600s. You might have had electricity before the Mongol Empire even existed. That might all sound like madness, but why not? And then there's medicine. We lost texts on surgery, anatomy, and disease, some of which might have prevented millions of deaths. No dark ages means no centuries-long medical standstill, fewer plagues, fewer needless amputations, and maybe, just maybe, people figure out bacteria before half of Europe dies from the Black Plague. And it's not just Western civilization gets the boost. The library pulled in works from across Mesopotamia, India, and China. Without its loss, the cross-pollination of ideas could have been off the charts thousands of years earlier than the Silk Road or colonialism ever managed. Of course, not everything would be rosy. Earlier tech means earlier weapons, and as we know from history, humans are warmongering boneheads. Atomic theory, in ancient hands, might mean Hiroshima came before the year 1000. Maybe humanity needed that extra 1,000 years of social development before we started dabbling with the end of the world. Maybe humanity was entirely destroyed by the year 1000 AD, and you, watching this video, you don't exist. Perhaps the destruction of the Great Library was, in a weird roundabout way, a blessing in disguise. But let's not get too apocalyptic too early in today's video. In an alternate timeline, the Library of Alexandria still stands, a towering archive of what we used to know, and in that world, we're centuries smarter and maybe centuries wiser too. August the 6th, 1945. A flash, a roar, silence, followed by generations of fallout. Hiroshima and Nagasaki didn't just signal the end of World War II, they were the start of a new era, one defined by the ability to wipe out cities with a single bomb. But what if President Truman said no? Let's say the US sticks to conventional invasion. Operation Downfall was the plan, but the Japanese mainland was heavily fortified. Kamikaze pilots, civilian militias, tunnel systems. This would not be a quick in and out. US estimates put the potential Allied death toll at 500,000 and the Japanese deaths at several million. Yeah, the nuclear bombings were horrendous, but it's difficult to imagine a cleaner outcome once the Americans arrived on Japanese shores. It certainly wouldn't have ended in August, that's for damn sure. Japan's military was nowhere near surrendering, and some factions were even planning to stage a coup after the emperor's surrender announcement. So, no atomic bomb probably means months, maybe years of more bloodshed. Then there's the Soviet wildcard. The USSR declared war on Japan just days before Hiroshima, so no bomb means they'd probably play a bigger role in the Japanese surrender. They could have split the country like Korea, US in the south, Soviets in the north. So now, imagine a Cold War with Japan divided down the middle. And what about the bomb itself? You can't uninvent it. The Manhattan Project has already succeeded, so if it's not used in Japan, when does it get its debut? Korea? Vietnam? A Soviet conflict? This was not the kind of thing that's just going to stay under wraps. Somebody is going to use it first, and the psychological shock of Hiroshima might have been the only thing that held others back. The bomb ended the war, but it also scared the living hell out of everyone watching. That fear of mutually assured destruction, as it was called, is what arguably kept the Cold War from going nuclear. No Hiroshima means no early global wake-up call, and maybe no deterrent strong enough to stop the next big war from going nuclear. So what are we left with? Maybe fewer civilian deaths in 1945, but really probably not. Projections of the loss of life associated with Operation Downfall were horrendously high. We're talking in the millions here. It for sure would have caused a longer war and maybe even a divided Japan. And somewhere else down the line, a mushroom cloud rising over a different city at a different time. In October 1962, there were 13 days that pushed the world closer to annihilation than it had ever been before, and has ever been since. Soviet missiles in Cuba, US warships on high alert, Kennedy and Khrushchev staring each other down across an invisible line, each waiting to see who blinked first. But what if nobody blinked? What if a Soviet submarine captain mistook a depth charge for an attack and launched a nuclear torpedo? What if a US spy plane shot down over Cuba had triggered a full-scale retaliation? What if one nervous commander had one bad call and set it all off? We don't need to imagine mushroom clouds from scratch. We already know where the bombs were aimed. Washington, New York, Moscow, Leningrad. Cities would be flattened in minutes, and millions would be dead before the first radio bulletin even aired. The US would have responded immediately because that was the doctrine. Massive, earth-shaking, planetary-altering retaliation. You hit us, we hit you back 10 times harder. Goodbye, large section of humanity. And once it starts, there's no reining it in. NATO bases in Europe would have been targets, as would American allies in Asia. The global map would have lit up with fire that quickly destroyed life as we know it. The first wave alone could have killed upward of 300 million people. And that's being conservative. Radiation, famine, collapse of infrastructure, that is just the warm-up, because next comes nuclear winter with global temperatures plummeting while sunlight struggles to reach the surface. Crops fail, economies crash, and society, well, there isn't really a society. Leadership across the world is decimated, with Kennedy and Khrushchev among the first to go. Most world governments are either incinerated or scrambling in bunkers, cut off and clueless. In their place, chaos takes over and civilian panic becomes military anarchy, where the survivors are not rebuilding, they are simply surviving. Even if a few major cities are spared, global trade would collapse overnight, so forget about fuel, medicine, and clean water. If you're lucky, you might be able to raid an abandoned supermarket. If you're not, and you're staring out over a landscape that looks eerily like Mad Max, then you'd better have your wits about you. Power grids would fail, while the internet would have never existed because the infrastructure was never built. The Cold War wouldn't have ended in 1991 because, well, everything would have ended in 1962. March the 15th, 44 BC, the Ides of March. Julius Caesar walks into the Senate expecting to speak, but he's carried out dead with 23 stab wounds. But what if Brutus had hesitated? What if the daggers stayed sheathed? First, forget the rise of Augustus, at least not in the way history remembers it. Caesar was already dictator for life, and despite the optics, he was slowly nudging Rome toward monarchy. He'd been stacking the Senate with loyalists, sidelining traditional power, and hinting more loudly with each statute that maybe Rome needed a king again. And of course, that king would be him. If he'd lived, he'd almost certainly have made it official. Not with a crown on the steps of the Capitol maybe, but functionally? Oh yes. Rome shifts from a republic to autocracy under his rule, not after his death like it did in our timeline. And it's not like the Senate would have done much to stop him. By that point, most senators had either been bought, bullied, or were too scared to push back. The assassination wasn't a stand for democracy, it was a desperate Hail Mary. And if it never happens, Caesar finishes the job. What follows is a smoother transition into an empire. No power vacuum, no civil war between Mark Antony and Octavian, no bloody purges to clean up loose ends. Caesar consolidates, centralizes, and continues to style himself as the solution to Rome's chaos. That also means a longer Pax Romana, peace under Caesar's sandal. His military reforms were already well underway, while infrastructure projects were accelerating. The man wasn't just a conqueror, he was a planner, a builder, and a propaganda machine. So imagine another 10, maybe 20 years of that momentum, and the map of Europe starts to look a lot more Roman. Caesar had unfinished business in the east, with Parthia next on his hit list. If it pulled it off, Rome might have extended deep into what is now Iran and beyond. That would have changed the balance of power between east and west centuries ahead of schedule. But there's a darker twist here too. While Caesar might have stabilized the empire in the short term, he also might have turned Rome into a dynastic monarchy right then and there, ending any chance of republican revival. And given his ambitions, it's fair to wonder whether his unchecked rule would have eventually turned tyrannical. Now, it's June 28th, 1914, and a car takes a wrong turn in Sarajevo, and that mistake, and the bullet that followed, would end up killing more than 20 million people. What if that car had kept going? What if Gavrilo Princip never pulled the trigger? The man in the backseat was Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne. His death lit the fuse on World War I, which redrew maps, collapsed empires, and changed the course of the 20th century. But without that spark, what happens next looks real different. First, let's be clear. Europe was already a brewing powder keg just waiting to go off. It was a strange time, with plenty of alliances and even more rivalries, with grievances sometimes stretching back hundreds of years. But there was no consensus on when or how war would break out, only that it probably was going to. So, if Franz Ferdinand had lived, war may still have come eventually, but just not in 1914, and maybe not in the same way. Franz was not popular with the military elite in Vienna, but ironically, he was one of the few voices pushing for peace. He opposed war with Serbia and didn't trust Germany's military leadership. He believed the empire needed to change if it was going to survive. Had he become emperor, the Austro-Hungarian Empire might have taken a slower, more negotiated approach to its internal problems. He wanted to give more autonomy to Slavic groups, Serbs, Croats, and Czechs, and that alone could have weakened the grip of nationalism that had been pulling the empire apart. Fewer internal fractures mean less incentive to throw punches abroad, and Austria-Hungary, already a patchwork of languages and loyalties, might have lasted longer. Maybe it would have fractured peacefully. Maybe it would have crumbled anyway. But the collapse would have been different and slower. Now, where everything gets really interesting is with the Kaiser juggernaut, which was Germany. Without Austria-Hungary dragging it into war, Germany might have continued its rise as an industrial powerhouse under the Kaiser unchecked. No Sarajevo bullets means no trench warfare, no Western Front, no 2 million deaths, and no Versailles Treaty to poison the well. And that last one is massively significant. If the Germans hadn't been forced to bend over the proverbial barrel at Versailles, there would have been no economic collapse, no simmering resentment, no fertile ground for generational whack jobs like Hitler to exploit. And without World War I, there is no World War II, not as we know it. No Holocaust, no atomic bomb dropped on Japan, no Cold War following it. Further east, the Russian bear develops completely differently. Without World War I and Russia's borderline inept part in it, the Tsar would likely have held on to power, which means no revolution, no communist takeover, no Soviet Union. So where does that leave us? Well, the 20th century is now completely unrecognizable. If we take the glass half full approach, there may have been decades of peace. If we want to err on the side of the negative, you could argue that humans were destined to march into the jaws of hell and teeter on the verge of complete obliteration. Of course, some other crisis could have kicked things off eventually. Alliances don't just dissolve because one man survives an assassination. But removing that moment, the point where a teenage nationalist and a poorly timed U-turn collided, definitely changes everything. June the 18th, 1815. Napoleon Bonaparte faces the British and Prussians at Waterloo. Rain-soaked fields, miscommunications, and a relentless Allied assault seal his fate. But what if it hadn't? What if Grouchy had arrived in time? What if Napoleon had broken the British line and forced Wellington into retreat? Well, first, the coalition crumbles, Britain pulls back, and the Prussians scatter. Suddenly, Europe looks very different, and Napoleon's final gamble pays off. Instead of exile to St. Helena, he marches back to Paris, a victorious emperor once again. Pomp, arrogance, and near invincibility. France, then reading from years of war and revolution, would fall back into line quickly. Napoleon wasn't just a conqueror, he was a symbol of stability through dominance. His return would mean re-establishing imperial rule, but this time even more aggressively consolidated. The monarchy, as it had existed before the revolution, does not return. The Ancien regime is gone for good, and so is any real shot at a democratic reform in France, at least for another century. The humiliated and weakened European powers would likely sue for peace, but peace was dictated on Napoleon's terms. Think the Treaty of Versailles, but with the French emperor as the cackling overlord. That means a redrawing of borders across the continent, with France at the center of everything. Poland might be restored under French protection. The Holy Roman Empire remains fragmented, and Spain, exhausted and unstable, becomes a satellite puppet. And Britain, despite its naval dominance, loses its position as the uncontested leader of the 19th century world order. Napoleon's economic and legal systems, especially the Napoleonic Code, would spread further and faster. Europe might have adopted uniform civil laws much earlier, and feudal remnants in Eastern Europe would have been swept away under pressure from a resurgent, centralized France. The balance of power that kept Europe in uneasy peace for decades is gone, and with it, any semblance of British-led liberal capitalism shaping the continent. Colonially, France might regain some footing. With Britain reeling and distracted, French ambitions in North Africa and the Caribbean would reignite. That would slow down the British Empire's explosive expansion and change the imperial race across Africa and Asia. But it comes with a cost. A longer Napoleonic reign almost certainly leads to further wars. Peace with Britain would be temporary, and tensions with Russia were never truly settled. It's difficult to say how it all ends. Napoleon was never going to retire quietly to a vineyard in the south of France, mellow afternoons wandering among the vines, bread and cheese for lunch on a quaint wooden table under a tree. That's just not Napoleon, is it? More likely, his megalomaniac Mr. Hyde re-emerges, and eventually he stretches France too thin again. Maybe he dies in battle, perhaps he's put to death. When he does die, be it 5, 10, or 15 years later, the succession problem hits hard. There's no clear heir with his charisma or military genius. France, once again, could splinter under the weight of its own ambitions. But by then, Europe's political landscape would have already been permanently rewritten. November the 22nd, 1963, Dallas, Texas. A bullet rips through the motorcade and the 35th President of the United States is dead. But what if it ducked? What if the shot missed? What if JFK survived? First, the Vietnam War does not spiral into the chaotic, bloody mess that it did. Kennedy had already started questioning the US commitment, and while he hadn't formally announced a withdrawal, there were signals. Advisors were being reassessed, strategies debated behind closed doors, and there's every reason to think that America's nightmare in the jungle never happens. Surviving Dallas also means he finishes his term and likely wins a second. An assassination survival tends to give you a healthy bump in the ratings. And with that, a chance to slowly pull the US out before the quagmire swallows half a generation. Without Vietnam defining the decade, the 1960s take a different path. No draft protests on college campuses, no Kent State, no endless rows of body bags. The counterculture movement might still emerge, but it's less angry, it's less fractured. Civil rights become the battleground much earlier, instead of being overshadowed by a war. And on that front, Kennedy's survival brings both clarity and risk. He'd been cautious on civil rights, publicly supportive, but hesitant to provoke the Southern Democrats too aggressively. In a second term, though, things shift and JFK goes all in. Without the need to run again, he has the political space to act and perhaps pushes through much stronger legislation. Maybe the Civil Rights Act of 1964 becomes his legacy and not Johnson's. That also changes the South's political realignment. If Kennedy were the one signing civil rights into law, the backlash would hit the Democratic Party harder and faster, possibly accelerating the conservative shift that would later define Nixon's Southern strategy. Internationally, Kennedy stared Khrushchev down in Cuba and walked away with the win, but only by the skin of his gleaming Massachusetts teeth. He wasn't interested in nuclear brinkmanship again, so maybe there's earlier detente, fewer proxy conflicts, and a slower arms race. Or maybe the pressure cooker shifts to another continent altogether. Either way, he's more cautious than his successors. There's also space for moonshot politics, quite literally. The Apollo program was JFK's baby, and he defiantly proclaimed that Americans would go to the moon by the end of the 60s. With him alive and driving it forward, the space race might stretch further. Mars doesn't just stay a dream, it becomes a long-term objective with public support shored up by a charismatic president who still believes in big, expensive visions. Culturally, the impact is seismic. No Zapruder film, no conspiracy theories, no 60-year-long debate about grassy knolls and magic bullets. Trust in government doesn't fracture quite so early, and the national psyche doesn't take the hit that never quite healed. But on the flip side, Kennedy wasn't perfect. He had enemies, scandals waiting to explode, and a private life that could have derailed a presidency in an age before 24-hour news. Surviving the bullet doesn't guarantee he escapes the storm, but at least it's a political storm, not a national trauma. Imagine it's 1974, not 1984, and the internet is already here. Not just military research prototypes, like ARPANET, the ancestor of the modern internet, but functional home connections, early search engines, email, and even primitive forums 10 years ahead of schedule. It doesn't sound like much on paper, but it shifts everything. It was start with the Cold War. Earlier digital communication means faster intelligence gathering and analysis. Governments could monitor satellite data, logistics, and troop movements in near real time, which might sound like stability, but it also increases the risk of escalation. One misunderstood message, one technical glitch, and you've got two nuclear powers reaching for that big red button that reads annihilation. Probably, before either understands what's really going on. If the internet arrives in the mid-1970s, it doesn't land during a tech boom, it hits during the tail end of Vietnam, the Watergate fallout, and rising distrust in institutions. That means the first online communities are not sharing memes, they're dissecting corruption, organizing protests, and spreading radical ideas. The internet becomes political from the very beginning. Music changes too. Bands like Led Zeppelin or Pink Floyd could have live-streamed their shows. Record labels would have lost control earlier, and punk, which was already anti-establishment, might have gone digital instead and made millions. Instead of vinyl and tape trades, you've got early file sharing, and that completely changes how music spreads and how fast. The media landscape fractures decades ahead of when it actually did, with newspapers and TV not getting a chance to dominate the late 20th century. Instead, niche websites and forums start forming in the 1980s, setting the stage for disinformation wars long before anyone was ready for them. The gatekeepers lose their grip faster, and with less time to adapt. Commerce is an entirely new ballgame. Amazon-level disruption hits in the mid-80s, not the mid-90s, which means brick-and-mortar retail starts dying off before it ever dominates suburban life. Credit cards and bank networks get pushed online fast, while shopping malls as cultural icons barely take root. Remote work doesn't start in 2020, it begins in 1990. Office towers get built with empty floors, or not at all. Maybe the skyscrapers of many of the biggest cities in the world look very different. Commuting patterns change, and cities develop differently with education shifts, universities offering digital resources decades before they did in our timeline. Now, so far, not so bad, but there's a sting in this what-if. Speak to scientists, doctors, researchers, teachers, and they'll all tell you that the tidal wave of technology has brought with it an even larger tsunami of mental and physical conditions. Depression, stress, anxiety, and suicide, these have all surged, especially with the introduction of smartphones. So if you move everything forward a couple of decades, these issues would likely have hit in the 1980s or 1990s instead of the mid-2010s. Mid-14th century Europe. A ship docks, a rat scurries down a rope, and within weeks, entire towns are coughing blood and dying in the streets. Over a third of Europe's population eventually died during the world's deadliest pandemic. But what if that ship never sailed? What if the Black Death had never happened? Well, first of all, the numbers. No plague means 25 to 50 million Europeans stay alive, and that changes everything. Economies don't collapse, entire villages aren't abandoned, and labor doesn't suddenly become the most valued commodity in Europe. Feudalism, which was already cracking, doesn't get its death blow, and the serfs stay tied to the land. Wages don't spike, mobility stays frozen. And the middle class is delayed, possibly by centuries. The aristocracy keeps its grip tighter and longer, while landowners never get desperate enough to negotiate. They don't need to. Their workers never vanish, so there's no leverage to force reforms and revolts, like the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 in England, which might never happen. Or if it does, it would fail without the population imbalance to back them up. Urbanization slows down, and with no urgent need to restructure rural life, cities don't grow as fast, and the mercantile class, the early business elite, emerges much later. That delays capitalism, which delays trade empires, which delays colonial expansion, which in turn affects the lives of millions around the world. With fewer deaths, there's less incentive to innovate. The desperation that pushed people to challenge authority, religious, political, scientific, just never gets that jump start. The Renaissance might still happen, but it's a slower burn. Art, science, and humanism all lose the urgency that comes from confronting mass mortality. Even the church stays strong. The plague shattered faith in religious institutions when prayers failed to stop the dying. There are only so many thoughts and prayers a person can give when their entire family has been carted off to one of the many mass plague graves being dug. No plague, the church's authority isn't shaken, which delays the Reformation. Martin Luther might still get annoyed by indulgences, but his complaints carry less weight in a world where the clergy didn't abandon half of Europe during its worst crisis. Globally, the ripple effect is staggering. The Ottoman Empire rises into a crowded, not depleted Europe, while the Mongol expansion into Europe faces stiffer resistance. And China, which also took a major hit from the plague, might retain its edge in exploration and innovation. Zheng He doesn't get recalled. The treasure fleets keep sailing, which we'll be coming back to shortly. And suddenly it's not Columbus who bumps into the Americas, it's someone under a dragon flag. The modern world was really built on the ashes of the Black Death. Take away those ashes and everything else builds more slowly. Populations surge, but power stays locked in the hands of kings and priests. Society survives, but it stagnates. In our timeline, a rat's changed the course of history, but without it, Europe breathes easier. But perhaps ironically, it doesn't develop nearly as fast. June 323 BC in Babylon. Alexander the Great, undefeated in battle, dies suddenly at just 32. Malaria, poisoning, typhoid. Historians still argue about which one. But what if he hadn't? What if he'd lived another 10 or 20 years? Alexander was the ultimate big daddy of his age. He already controlled an empire that stretched from Greece to India, unprecedented in scale, stitched together by war, diplomacy, and just raw charisma. But he wasn't stable. No clear air, no blueprint for secession, and a leadership circle full of ambitious generals meant that it broke apart instantly without him. But with him? Well, the first thing to go is fragmentation. There's no power vacuum. The empire holds firm. Alexander has plans, massive infrastructure projects, new cities, even military campaigns deeper into Arabia. His rule wasn't about maintaining borders, but pushing them outward. With a few more decades, the empire might have reached the Atlantic in the west and China in the east. Trade routes would have connected the Mediterranean, Persia, India, and maybe even parts of Southeast Asia centuries before the Silk Road fully matured. Hellenistic culture, already spreading like wildfire, becomes the dominant thread binding East and West. Greek becomes not just a scholarly language, but a global one. Maybe, right now, in that timeline, I'll be talking to you in Greek, except I wouldn't, because obviously I wouldn't exist. Now, culturally, and neither would you. Now, culturally, this fusion reshapes philosophy, religion, architecture, just about everything. You don't just get Greek statues in Afghanistan or Indian elephants in Macedonian mosaics. You get a shared intellectual ecosystem with Aristotle's logic and Indian metaphysics occupying the same space. It could have been a wild and fascinating East-West collaboration where science and maths progresses faster, and Alexandria doesn't just build a library, it becomes the capital of an intellectual knowledge empire. Politically, Alexander would have had to govern, not just conquer. That means codifying laws, balancing regional powers, and integrating local elites. His attempt at a unifying class, marrying his officers to Persian nobles and adopting Eastern customs, was controversial but calculated. Given time, that might have solidified into a multi-ethnic ruling system unique for the ancient world. And militarily, he would have faced new challenges. Rome was still a rising republic. If Alexander turned west, he meets them head-on. And what a matchup that could have been. But honestly, Alexander steamrolls Rome and goes straight into the Italian peninsula. Maybe no Roman Empire. And that in itself changes everything about the modern world. Religion shifts too. No fragmentation means no later cultural gaps for Christianity or Islam to rise into. Paganism lasts longer or morphs, absorbing Eastern mysticism, Zoroastrian dualism, and Indian cosmology into something new entirely. Of course, Alexander's not immortal though. Even with extra decades, he dies eventually. And when he does, the succession still matters. But if he has had time to build institutions, set up a dynasty, and transition from warlord to emperor, the fallout looks very different. April the 14th, 1912. It's a calm, clear night in the North Atlantic. The unsinkable, luxurious, and outrageously overconfident RMS Titanic steams ahead at full speed. Those in first class toast another glass of champagne, while those in the bowels of the ship's third-class cabins dream of a new and better life in the United States. But what if the iceberg never hits? Or rather, what if the Titanic veers left just in time? Firstly, of course, nobody dies. Over 1,500 passengers and crew live to tell the tale. Some, like John Jacob Astor or Isidor Straus, go on to influence finance and politics. Others fade into history, but their survival means more than just saved lives. It means the Titanic becomes a living legend, not a maritime grave. The ship completes its maiden voyage, docking in New York to a media frenzy. Fireworks, ticker tape, the whole shebang. The White Star Line, already a powerhouse, becomes a global brand, and Titanic's success validates the arms race in luxury liners. Bigger, faster, flashier. The focus remains on prestige, not safety, and without the disaster, no one sees the cracks in the system. Because the thing is that while it would have saved lives, it would also have meant that lifeboat regulations, 24-hour radio monitoring, and better ice patrols were not introduced as they were after the tragedy. Without the iceberg, none of that happens. The same weak safety standards remain in place for years, maybe decades, and it's entirely likely that another ship, maybe in another ocean on another night, experiences a similar disaster, perhaps an even worse one. Public trust in engineering also stays dangerously inflated. The Titanic was the peak of Edwardian ambition, an era convinced that it could conquer nature through sheer scale. If the Titanic makes it to New York and basks in self-congratulations and pomp, that arrogance gets reinforced. The world doubles down on excess, corners get cut, and disaster just gets delayed. There's also a massive cultural shift. The sinking marked the end of a kind of innocence and shattered the myth that progress was unstoppable. It was a time of extraordinary vision, but that was built on a rickety assumption that nothing could go wrong. Yes, there had been disasters, but the Titanic tragedy was a sucker punch to inflated egos and industrial revolution arrogance. Four planes, 19 hijackers, nearly 3,000 dead. September the 11th, 2001. This was the day where history was split into a before and after. But what if it hadn't happened? What if the plot had been uncovered, the planes grounded, and the towers left standing? Let's say, or one of the FBI field agents, who were already raising red flags, gets taken seriously. The flight school lessons, now a painfully obvious oversight, get investigated, and the hijackers are arrested. The Twin Towers remain a fixture of the New York skyline. In the immediate term, the US avoids the trauma. No burning towers, no collapse, no smoke-covered streets, and no frantic last phone calls. The psychological wound that defined it never opens. And without that trauma, the entire post-9/11 security state never materializes. There's no Patriot Act, no TSA pat-downs, no mass surveillance programs exposed by Snowden. The Department of Homeland Security probably never forms. Airport security remains, by today's standards, laughable. Internationally, the absence of 9/11 reshapes US foreign policy. There's no war in Afghanistan and no invasion of Iraq, no 20-year military quagmire. Osama bin Laden stays a name in a file, not public enemy number one, and the US doesn't sink trillions into counterinsurgency and thousands of soldiers who don't come home. Iraq, without a US invasion, avoids being ripped open. Saddam Hussein remains in power, a brutal dictator, yes, but not one whose fall creates a vacuum for ISIS to rise. The Middle East stays messy, but it doesn't ignite into the chaos that defined the 2010s. Refugee crises, radicalization, drone warfare, these might still exist, but they'd be at a fraction of the scale. Domestically, the political landscape shifts. George W. Bush doesn't get the wartime president boost, which may change the 2004 election. Maybe John Kerry wins. And maybe the US takes a different path on climate, healthcare, or even the financial crisis when it hits in 2008. But the danger isn't erased, it's just postponed. There were enough people who wanted to see the United States bleed, and it's impossible to think that Al-Qaeda would turn around and say, well, we gave it a go, let's give up this terrorism thing and just go home and tend our flocks and sow our fields. Al-Qaeda may still try again. Different targets, different tactics, who knows? Maybe something even worse. And without the wake-up call of 9/11, the US might be slower to react next time, less unified, less prepared. The first strike might land elsewhere, and with even greater devastation. Think biological warfare. Maybe even something nuclear. It's April 4th, 1968. In Memphis, Tennessee, a shot rings out, and the voice behind I Have a Dream is silenced. But what if James L. Ray missed? What if Martin Luther King Jr. survived? To begin with, the civil rights movement doesn't lose its most unifying figure at its most fragile moment. By 1968, the movement was splintering, some leaning toward non-violence, others towards black power. King's death cemented that fracture, but if he'd lived, he might have held the line, bridging the gap between integrationists and more radical voices. And it's not just about speeches. King pivoted and focused less on race alone and more on economic justice. His Poor People's Campaign aimed to unite Americans across racial lines around poverty, inequality, and workers' rights. That agenda scared people more than his civil rights demands ever did. So if he lives, that campaign gains traction and terrifies both the establishment and parts of the white working class. King also turned sharply against the Vietnam War and wasn't subtle about it. He called the US government the greatest purveyor of violence in the world. If he survives, that message will get louder, and he will become a moral anchor for the anti-war movement, one the government can't easily ignore or discredit. That adds legitimacy, power, and visibility to protests already rocking the country. Politically, he would become a kingmaker, if not a candidate himself. He likely wouldn't have run for office, but candidates would have sought his blessing. Civil rights legislation after 1968 might have been stronger, while the pushback against busing, housing desegregation, and voting rights rollbacks might have been weaker because King was still there, pressing from the front. The backlash, though, would be fierce. The FBI was already watching King, and surviving an assassination attempt wouldn't have made them back off, it would have made them more aggressive. COINTELPRO would have doubled down. The government feared King not because of what he said, but because of what he might unify. The 1970s play out very differently. Watergate still happens, and the economy still stalls, but maybe the black political landscape shifts. You get more mayors, more governors, more members of Congress much earlier. Jesse Jackson doesn't just run in the 1980s, he might be a contender a decade sooner, with King beside him. Culturally, King becomes a long-term figure, not a martyr frozen in time, but a voice that grows, adapts, and evolves. We hear what he thinks about apartheid, Reagan, and the crack epidemic. He becomes not just a memory, but a presence, someone who could walk into a room and change its temperature. In short, he is somebody that we could have done with for much longer than the 39 years he was alive. C for all mankind for this one. On July the 20th, 1969, Neil Armstrong stepped onto the lunar surface and the United States declared victory in the space race by planting the stars and stripes into the moon and effectively raising a middle finger salute to the Soviet Union. But what if it wasn't him? What if the red flag went up first? What if the Soviets beat America to the moon? And they were close. The USSR had the first satellite, the first man in space, and the first woman in space. They led nearly every milestone in the final stretch, so the geopolitical impact would have been enormous if they'd managed to land a cosmonaut, Alexei Leonov, and make him the first person to walk on the moon in 1969 or earlier. Now we'll begin with global prestige, or rather the phallic length measuring contest that was the Cold War. You see, the Cold War wasn't just fought with missiles, it was fought with symbols, and nothing symbolized technological dominance like the moon. A Soviet first landing would have been a PR masterstroke, and countries on the fence, newly independent nations in Africa, Asia, Latin America, might have tilted toward Moscow, seeing the USSR as the future, not the fading West. In the US, the shock would have been nuclear. NASA would face the kind of scrutiny that kills budgets, and the sense of national failure wouldn't just affect scientists, it would cut across culture, politics, and military confidence. Domestically, it could shake the American psyche. 1969 was already a volatile year. Vietnam, civil rights protests, and political assassinations were still fresh. Losing the moon would have felt like losing the century, and it would have hardened divisions, accelerated paranoia, and possibly pushed the US government into even riskier Cold War behavior to reclaim the narrative. But for the Soviets, the win wouldn't come without cost. Their space program was always a patchwork of competing design bureaus, political rivalries, and technical shortcuts. So, yes, the Soviets did well in the early years of the space race, but this was not a program equipped to go deep. A moon landing might have stretched them too far too fast, and who knows what disaster might have arrived as a result. A dead cosmonaut on the moon might have erased the glory instantly. But assuming all goes right, a successful Soviet moon mission likely prolongs the space race. The US wouldn't quit. It'd grit its teeth and double down. Mars might have become the next target earlier, not just a dream, and defense spending, already bloated, would explode. Satellites, space stations, and military hardware in orbit all accelerate, which means far less money being spent on Earth. Imagine a 1970s and 80s with the US and Soviet Union spending 25% of their budgets trying to outdo each other in space. The last emperor in the West is forced off his throne, and with him an empire crumbles. What follows isn't just a collapse, it's a complete system crash. But what if that moment never came? What if Rome held on, adjusted its armor, gave those pesky Visigoths a mighty hiding, and kept on marching? Well, the Dark Ages wouldn't just dim, they might not exist at all. The roads stay paved, the aqueducts keep flowing, and trade continues without a 1,000-year detour. Cities remain full, not gutted. Books stay in libraries, not buried in monasteries. Knowledge doesn't just survive, it evolves. Christianity still rises, but its shape is different. Instead of rival popes battling over scraps of influence, the church answers to a state that never went away. Doctrine gets filtered through bureaucracy, not backroom councils, and faith becomes streamlined, less feudal chaos, more imperial efficiency. Technological progress doesn't stall, it accelerates. Roman engineers were already ahead of their time with concrete, heating, and hydraulics. Give them another few centuries uninterrupted, and you're looking at early industrialization. Printing presses churn out scrolls before the year 1000. Telescopes, steam engines, even rudimentary science labs all arrive long before the Renaissance gets a chance to be a comeback tour. Europe doesn't splinter into duchies and mini-kingdoms arguing over cattle. Instead, it stays stitched together. France, Germany, and Britain remain Roman provinces or end up reabsorbed or reshaped under a single imperial standard. The idea of a nation never fully blooms because the empire never makes room for it. Global expansion changes completely. Instead of 3 ships drifting west under Spanish flags, Roman fleets cross the Atlantic with engineers, road blueprints, and bureaucrats in tow. Colonization comes with census takers and infrastructure plans, not just flags, muskets, and disease. Slavery, entrenched in Roman life, probably endures longer than we'd like to admit. But machines don't argue, unionize, or get tired, and once industrial power starts paying off, slavery shifts from standard practice to deadweight. Rome doesn't ban it out of morality, they ban it because it's just bad for business. Of course, no empire lasts forever. If Rome survives, it changes shape. Maybe it leans democratic. It can become more brutal. Maybe the East and West don't merge, but shadowbox for centuries, 2 halves of the same legacy, trying to out-civilize each other. Or perhaps that's the Cold War. Either way, decline doesn't vanish, it just transforms. Early 1400s. Towering ships, some longer than football fields, cut across the ocean. Sails stretched wide. Admiral Zheng He leads China's armada from port to port, trading silk and porcelain for spices and exotic animals. They reach India, Arabia, East Africa, and then nothing. The voyage stops, the records are shelved, and the ships are burned. China turns inward, and the world tilts west. But what if it didn't? What if the Ming Dynasty had kept going? Not just 7 expeditions, but 70. Chinese ships might have rounded the Cape of Good Hope, crossed the Atlantic, and spotted Europe before Europe thought to look east. Lisbon doesn't launch explorers, it greets them. The age of exploration begins a century early, just not in Europe. Trade networks form with a Chinese spine. Ports from Mombasa to Marseille start flying red and gold. Europe, still brushing soot off its face from the medieval period, squints at China not as myth, but as a market leader, wealthy, literate, technically terrifying. And that shifts everything. Confucianism spreads across Africa, and Chinese medicine competes with Islamic scholars. Gunpowder moves faster, and war starts to look more like maths than muscle. The Americas might still get found, but by Chinese sailors, not Spanish ones. They bring maps, translators, and tribute gifts. Maybe there is still blood. Maybe there's also less. The cultural collision happens sooner, with more voices in the room. Perhaps it's not a case of New Amsterdam and New York, but maybe it's New Shanghai. Back home, China keeps building. Bigger ships, better charts, stronger institutions, and their naval power doesn't fade. It becomes policy. And with trade booming, reform doesn't stall. Mechanization kicks off in Asia, not Manchester, and industrialization begins with chopsticks, not coal smoke. Meanwhile, Europe stays in second gear. The Renaissance still comes, but it's shaped by Chinese imports, not ancient Greek texts passed through Arabic middlemen. The scientific revolution begins not as a rediscovery, but as a remix. Religion spreads differently too. Buddhism and Islam go global by sea, and Christianity doesn't get a monopoly. There's no Vatican colonial complex. There's no one faith that writes the rules. You get a genuinely multipolar world, messier, maybe fairer. So why did it stop? Well, short and sweet answer: fear and political backbiting. A court so obsessed with control it saw the horizon as a threat. They didn't just burn ships, they torched momentum, and with it a chance to steer the future. If they hadn't, the center of cultural gravity wouldn't have drifted west. It would have stayed where the dragon banners flew, planted firmly in the east. November the 9th, 1989. One misread memo, one flustered press conference, and suddenly East Berliners are crossing checkpoints, cheering, crying, climbing walls that were meant to stand forever. This is interesting because it shows how earth-altering consequences can hinge on the words of a single person. Günter Schabowski, a member of the East German government, made a misstatement at a press conference regarding new travel regulations. He claimed that the border crossings were open when in fact they weren't. But it didn't matter. Hundreds of thousands poured toward the wall and history changed. But what if that moment never came? What if a tired and flustered Günter Schabowski hadn't been put in front of a microphone? What if the wall stayed up? Let's start with Germany. No reunification means East Germany, the so-called German Democratic Republic, remains a Soviet satellite. It's stuck in concrete, shortages, and bad hairstyles. West Germany keeps humming, a capitalist powerhouse with Adidas and autobahns, while the East stagnates. Families stay split, cultures divide further, and Berlin remains two cities, one glossy, one grey. This buys the Soviet Union some time. Not much, but enough to drag things out. Without the symbolic kick to the testicles that was losing East Germany, Gorbachev keeps spinning plates. The economy's still tanking, the system's still cracked, but maybe the collapse crawls instead of crashing. The USSR limps into the 1990s, maybe even past epic drinker-cum-president Boris Yeltsin. Eastern Europe stalls too. Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia. They were all ready to jump, but Berlin's breach was the signal. Without it, regimes dig in. Protests fizzle or get crushed. The dominoes don't fall, they just wobble a bit. And liberal democracy stays a theory. Dictatorships get a few more years. Some get decades. NATO changes course. No German reunification means no expansion east. The Baltics remain firmly in Moscow's orbit, and Ukraine is caught in limbo. Russia feels less encircled, but also less constrained. The tension doesn't vanish, it just simmers beneath the Cold War frostbite. The European Union doesn't evolve in the same way. There's no economic boom from integrating East Germany, no unified Germany leading from the front. The Eurozone's weaker, and integration is slower. Europe remains fractured, a market, not a bloc. In the US, the Cold War doesn't end with applause, it drags on. The military-industrial complex stays flush. Politicians keep conjuring Red Scare ghosts well into the 2000s. Budget lines for tanks and spy planes don't shrink, they get rebranded. Culturally, the war's shadow stays long. That post-Cold War glow, the brief, naive sense that history had wrapped up neatly and we were all going to live happily ever after, never materializes. There's no democratic victory lap, just an old grudge wearing a new suit. Eventually, the wall would still fall. Nothing that unnatural survives forever, but maybe it doesn't fall in peace. Maybe it falls in chaos, smoke, and anger, not celebration. No David Hasselhoff concert, just blaring siren. And the 1990s don't feel like a turning point. They feel like the Cold War's B-side. Less ideology, more inertia. Same song, different decade. June 1942, the Pacific is vast, but the war does turn on a dot, and that's Midway Island, barely a speck on the map. 4 Japanese carriers steam toward it, confident, fast, and sharp. They want to finish what they started at Pearl Harbor, but instead they're ambushed, the tide turns, Japan never really recovers. But what if they'd won? Well, this time there's no trap, there's no flames, no shocked admirals staring at smoke belching from Japanese carriers. Instead, it's the Americans who got blindsided. The Yorktown Enterprise and Hornet go under, Midway falls, and suddenly, Hawaii doesn't feel untouchable, it feels vulnerable. With the US fleet scattered, Japan seizes its moment. They grip tighter on the Philippines, push deeper into the South Pacific, and maybe even glance toward Australia. American supply lines stretch too far and they start snapping. There's no grand comeback in 1943, only damage control and desperate defense. Back in Washington, Roosevelt watches the mood turn. After Pearl Harbor, Americans wanted payback, but a loss of Midway stings, and isolationists begin to speak louder. The draft expands. Factories still roar, but there's tension. A war machine running hot. A nation haunted by doubt. Midway, you see, was the boost the Americans they desperately needed. If you take that away, things become really quite desperate. Meanwhile, the Manhattan Project moves faster. The bomb was already in motion, but now it's really urgent. Every week, the war drags on, adding pressure to finish it. Hiroshima might not be the target, it could be Tokyo or whatever city's closest when the call comes. And the shockwaves definitely don't stop at the Pacific. The Soviets still march through Manchuria, but with the US off balance, they grab more ground. Korea might go fully red, while China's civil war breaks out faster, tipped by Soviet muscle and American distraction. The war doesn't end in 1945, it stretches into 46, maybe 47, and when it ends, it's not clean. More cities burn, more civilians die, and the occupation that follows isn't a blueprint for peace, it's a vicious period of reprisals and payback. Even decades later, the balance stays off. America doesn't rise quite so high, quite so fast. Japan still loses, but they carve out more space on the way down. The US still wins eventually, just not on its own terms. Midway wasn't just a battle. It was a hinge. And if it had swung the other way, the Pacific would have become longer, uglier, and far less certain. At its peak, the British Empire stretched across a quarter of the globe and ruled 1 in 5 people. It wasn't just power, it was prestige, flags in every time zone, tea, and rather beige food. But by the mid-20th century, cracks spread, gaping cracks that no amount of stiff upper lip could mask. Uprisings flared, independence movements surged, and bit by little bit, the empire just crumbled. But what if it didn't? What if Britain holds on through force, finesse, or just sheer refusal to change? India doesn't break away. Kenya, Nigeria, Jamaica, they all stay tethered to the crown. First come the consequences. Leaders like Gandhi don't get podiums, they get prison. Reforms are stalled, dangled, or faked, and resistance is crushed before it gathers steam. Once poised for post-war recovery, Britain doubles down on rule by rifle. But suppression breeds blowback. Peaceful protest dies and guerrilla war spreads. From Calcutta to Kingston, armed resistance grows and the empire bleeds money and soldiers. At home, the NHS withers and the welfare state sags. Britain keeps its empire, but it can't afford the empire. Globally, the Cold War reroutes. Without decolonization, the Soviets lose allies but gain a propaganda goldmine. Every time Britain talks of freedom, Moscow shows a colony in chains. NATO frays, morale fractures, the West looks hypocritical. Inside Britain, immigration spikes earlier. Subjects move freely, and cities like London change fast. Culture blooms, but so does backlash. Race riots spark in the 50s, and anti-immigration voices rise decades ahead of schedule. Culturally, identity hardens. Britain does not evolve past the empire. It clings desperately to it like a ravenous dog. Schoolbooks praise conquest, and questioning the narrative becomes unpatriotic. Pride curdles into delusion. Economically, the model absolutely rots. Resources are flowing in, but resistance drains profits, leading to infrastructure breaks and development lag. The empire grows brittle. Big on paper, yeah, but somewhat weak at the core, essentially a little like what happened to the Soviet Union in the end. Internationally, the world turns cold. The UN condemns, allies drift, trade partners look elsewhere. Britain becomes a relic, powerful in memory, marginal in practice. That sounds familiar. A lion still roaring, but mostly at itself, and when the empire finally falls, it's not gentle. There's no ceremonies, no neat handovers. It collapses in fire and fury, not out of generosity, but out of exhaustion. For more than 2,000 years, caste has shaped life across India. It dictated who you could marry, where you could live, and what job you were allowed to do. Your birth, it wasn't just biology, it was a lifelong sentence. But what if that framework had never taken hold? What if caste had never rooted itself into the nation? Well, to start with, daily life looks radically different. No untouchables, rigid priesthoods, or invisible walls dividing you from opportunity. Instead of ceilings, there's ladders. A potter's daughter becomes a judge. A farmer's son writes philosophy. And because of that, social mobility is not a dream, it's just how things work. That shift changes religion too. The Vedas still emerge and the great epics still unfold, but without Varana Sharma casting everyone into 4 inherited roles. Temples don't restrict entry based on birth, while rituals aren't passed down like heirlooms, they are learned. This means that anyone can reach the divine as long as they are willing to study. Politically, it opens up the landscape. Power doesn't come from your surname, it comes from your skill. That's why kings don't just rise from warrior clans. They come from anywhere. And since rulers aren't locked in by bloodlines, rebellion against inequality happens less often. Not because power's perfect, because it's not preordained. Culture stretches so much wider as well. The upper echelon doesn't protect classical music, dance, and literature. They are shared, passed along, remixed. Sanskrit doesn't become a fossil. It survives as a living language because it belongs to everybody. Folk traditions don't stay folk. They're celebrated as just part of the mainstream. And then the British arrive, but without caste, their most valuable divide and conquer tool is missing. Census categories don't segment Indians into Brahmins and Dalits, so colonialism becomes more complicated to manage. Resistance movements grow more unified, not less, and labels that once split people apart never get codified into law. By the time independence comes, something else happens too. There's no need for affirmative action because exclusion wasn't hardwired into the foundation. The Constitution doesn't outlaw caste because caste never had power to begin with. Leaders rise from every background, not as exceptions, but as the norm. And even abroad, the difference is obvious. There are no caste-based headlines, no debates in diaspora communities about temple entry or who can marry whom. Caste doesn't come up at all because it was never there to follow anyone overseas. Of course, inequality doesn't vanish. Class, religion, gender, and language still shape lives, but what's missing is the most toxic part, the idea that dignity is inherited, that hierarchy is sacred, and that birth should lock you into place forever. In the early 1930s, Stalin didn't look invincible. His grip was tight, but it wasn't yet locked in. The purges had begun in full. Rivals still lurked in the shadows, and trust inside the party was brittle. So, what if someone acted? What if Stalin was removed by coup, arrest, or just a single well-placed bullet? The first thing that changes is leadership, of course. No Stalin means no cult of personality, or maybe a different cult of personality. We don't really know. Instead of one paranoid megalomaniac pulling every lever, power spreads out. A committee takes over, maybe Bukharin, Zinoviev, or even Trotsky if he's brought back from exile. That doesn't mean democracy, but it means less fear. No reign of terror, no gulags filled with poets, no engineered famines to punish dissent. That alone rewrites Soviet history. Collectivization might still happen, but not at the pace Stalin forced it. There's no Holodomor, no fields emptied by ideology. Farmers stay farmers, not corpses with ration cards. Industry still builds, but without the pile of skulls beneath every factory, the economy lurches forward, not sprints through blood. Abroad, the effects come fast. A Trotsky-led USSR tries to export revolution, not isolate itself. That stirs up Europe and uprisings in Germany, France, Spain. They all get a boost. The World War doesn't start with Poland, because without Stalin, there's no Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Hitler faces a two-front gamble from the start, or doesn't gamble at all. And the Soviet army isn't gutted by Stalin's relentless delusional purges. Generals like Cherkassovsky are alive and planning, so when war does come, the Red Army isn't rebuilding, it's ready. The Winter War with Finland might go differently, and the Nazi blitz might stall sooner. After the war, the world doesn't split as neatly. No Stalin means no Iron Curtain, or at least a thinner Iron Curtain. Eastern Europe does still lean left, but maybe not with tanks and secret police. The Cold War begins, but it doesn't carry the same edge that a personality like Stalin adds to the flames. Maybe there's less fear, fewer blockages, fewer possibilities of impending doom. This also means the Soviet Union develops really differently. Stalin went after intellectuals, writers, artists, and teachers like a rabid dog, so well, imagine if none of that happens. The USSR does still censor, it is still authoritarian, but the sheer paranoia of it all is just dialed way down. By the 50s, you've got a flawed superpower Soviet Union, but not one that's drowning in blood. not cursed by ghosts of purges and show trials. It ain't heaven, but it's definitely less of a hell. And the 20th century, it looks a little less scorched, all because someone pulled the trigger early. Before Pearl Harbor, the US wasn't exactly charging into war, it was mostly ducking it. Most Americans didn't want to die in French fields or Pacific jungles, why would they? And isolationism was the policy and the mood. But what if that mood stuck? What if Pearl Harbor never happened, or if the US simply stayed out of it? Let's start in Europe. Britain holds the line, but just barely. The Soviets become the only shield against Hitler, absorbing staggering losses without help from a Western front. No D-Day, no American troops in Normandy. Western Europe doesn't get liberated, it either stays under Nazi boots or gets swallowed by the Red Army. That changes the whole post-war map. France might emerge as a puppet state or shift red. Germany splits differently or doesn't split at all, and the Iron Curtain drops sooner and stretches farther. Berlin doesn't get divided between East and West, it just becomes East. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, Japan digs in. With no US island-hopping campaign and no fleet steaming toward Tokyo, the front stalls. China keeps bleeding under occupation. Australia stands alone, or maybe even gets invaded, while Japan consolidates, fortifies, and holds on longer than anyone wants. Economically, the US misses its boom. I mean, say what you want about the horrors of the Second World War, but it absolutely made the United States the country that it is today. No wartime contracts to revive factories, no GI Bill to build the middle class, no Marshall Plan to turn Europe into a marketplace for American goods. The Depression doesn't end with victory, it drags, and American global influence never really fully arrives. Politically, things tighten inward. NATO never forms. The UN, if it exists, doesn't really carry any weight. Cold War still simmers, but it's between Moscow and a threadbare Britain or maybe Germany that never got flattened. Either way, America watches from the bleachers. Domestically, the ripple hits hard. No war effort means no mass entry of women into the workforce, no military service that jumpstarts civil rights, no economic acceleration to lift wages and expectations. Segregation sticks around, gender roles harden. The society that emerged from the war, the famed greatest generation, well, they never emerge at all. Just a nation that chose comfort over confrontation and a world that changed while it stood still. Now, by the early 1990s, apartheid in South Africa was teetering. Sanctions bit hard, unrest surged, and the world watched on. But what if the regime didn't budge? What if it dug in, doubling down instead of backing off? Well, first comes the fire. Protests escalate into a full-blown insurgency. The ANC, already underground and armed, ramps up attacks, and townships don't just resist, they erupt in fury. What looked like urban unrest in the 80s now feels like open civil war, to which the government answers with more guns, more arrests, more laws written in fear. International pressure intensifies, sanctions deepen, sporting and cultural boycotts expand, foreign investment dries up, the South African rand tanks, inflation spikes, and the already brittle economy begins to collapse under the weight of its own isolation. The white minority government clings to power with increasing desperation. Martial law becomes permanent, dissenters vanish into prisons or morgues. The state grows more brutal, more paranoid, and more detached from reality. South Africa turns into another pariah state. North Korea, with vineyards. The world watches, nervous but distant. Western governments under pressure from activists can't support Pretoria, and the Soviet Union's gone, so there's no Cold War excuse. But intervention's unlikely. South Africa spirals in slow motion with no outside force willing to step in. Meanwhile, brain drain accelerates. White South Africans with means flee to Australia, Canada, and the UK. Skilled labour evaporates. Infrastructure deteriorates. Universities, hospitals, and cities just begin to hollow out. The country becomes a relic in a post-colonial world. And Mandela? If apartheid doesn't end, he probably dies in prison. There's no negotiations, no truth commissions, no peaceful transition. His name lives on, but not as a president or a peacemaker, but just as a martyr. Eventually, change still comes, but not peacefully. The apartheid regime either collapses under its own contradictions or is overthrown in a violent uprising. The cost is staggering. Thousands dead, cities in ruin, decades of healing ahead. The South Africa we know, flawed, unequal, but democratic, never arrives. Instead, there's a fractured, wounded nation still paying the price for a system that should have ended long before it did. In the late 1800s, Europe turned its gaze southward with a single obsession: carve up the continent, claim the spoils, essentially strip Africa of everything they could. But what if they'd met real resistance? What if Africa's kingdoms had seen what was coming and stopped it? Instead of fighting alone, empires like the Zulu, Ashanti, Dahomey, and Buganda talk, trade, and unify. Not perfectly, but enough. They build alliances, learn quickly, buy guns, build roads, train soldiers, and refuse to be played off one another. Divide and conquer doesn't work if no one's playing along. Because of that, the colonial grab slows, and European armies hit walls, literal and political ones. Campaigns drag on, cost more, return less, some end in blood and retreat. The spectre of European superiority and invincibility vanishes. Parliamentarians in London start asking why British troops are dying in jungles for gold mines they'll never see as public support fades. Investment dries up. Meanwhile, African kingdoms get stronger and trade flows in every direction. Cities modernize on their own terms. Education spreads without replacing culture, and new languages emerge, hybrids of local dialects and global tongues. Instead of importing governance, they remix it with their existing African cultures. Monarchies evolve, councils form, power gets shared in ways that feel rooted, not imported. Without the Berlin Conference slicing up the map into absurd straight lines that often divided tribes, borders make a lot more sense now. They follow rivers, cultures, mountains, not the white man's whims taken from Belgian kings and French generals. As for the civil wars of the 20th century, some still happen, but they're undoubtedly far fewer because there's a less ethnic tension engineered by foreign lines. Back in Europe, the continent starts to feel the absence. No Congo rubber rush, no West African gold spree, less fuel for empire, slower industrial growth, and fewer footholds in global politics. Britain still builds its navy and France still flexes its muscle, but they do it with less swagger and a lot more debt. The cultural shift runs even deeper. African philosophies shape education, while music and fashion move outward instead of being absorbed. Religious traditions stay intact rather than being replaced by missionaries in pressed linen and strange ideas. By the 20th century, the world looks very different. Africa isn't developing, it's developed in its own way. Lagos rivals London. Nairobi trades with Shanghai. Accra hosts peace talks instead of aid conferences. And the word post-colonial never needs inventing. Would everything be perfect? No, absolutely not. Power still concentrates and greed still corrupts, but the difference is who gets to make the mistakes and who gets to fix them. Picture the 1820s. Steam engines clatter, cities swell, and men in stovepipe hats draft and vote on laws about everything, including the role of women. And the women themselves, not allowed anywhere near a voting booth. But what if that changed? What if women got the vote 100 years ahead of schedule? The moment they step into the political arena, everything tilts. Education becomes a battleground first. Girls' schools get funding, the curriculum widens, and reading isn't just for boys and Bibles. Mothers start showing up at school boards. Daughters start heading to universities. Literacy climbs, expectation shifts, and the phrase, "a woman's place," starts to lose its sting. Then the workforce changes as female lawmakers push back against child labor and sweatshops, not with petitions but with policy. Labor laws tighten, wages edge upward, and factories get watched. And suddenly, women's roles aren't limited to the home. They are on paper, in law, and they're gaining ground. Social norms start to bend much sooner too. Property laws change, which means marriage isn't a contract of control, it's a partnership with rights. Divorce becomes possible, inheritance starts to look fair, and you don't need a husband to own a house or a father to sign off on a loan. And with women voting in the 1800s, they didn't just change domestic life, they influenced war, peace, and empire. This is a common point often brought up. If women had had more power, would the world have collapsed into two savage and largely pointless conflicts that killed a combined 70 to 80 million people during the 20th century? Maybe fewer wars got rubber-stamped, and maybe empires shrank faster, or perhaps nothing slows the march of conquest. But the people who pay the price got more of a say. Who knows? By the time the real 1920s hit, we're not just flappers or factory workers, they're senators, judges, and reformers who've been shaping the world for a century. The phrase, "first woman too," stops being a headline, it's just history. Now, obviously, this isn't perfect, and there would be some kind of backlash from the small section of society that grows up so stunted they can't bear the thought of women with any kind of power, and that might stall progress, but the difference is time. 100 extra years to build, fight, lose, win, and try again. And it all starts with a ballot box that opens when corsets still clung tight and revolutions still arrived on horseback. In 1993, Albert Einstein fled Germany with a suitcase and a target on his back. The Nazis had seized power, burned books, and labeled his work Jewish physics. But what if it stayed? What if Einstein had never boarded that ship to America? First, Germany keeps its greatest minds. The man who unlocked the universe doesn't end up in Princeton, he stays in Berlin. Quantum theory deepens and nuclear physics accelerates, but under a swastika. And that changes a lot. Einstein was a pacifist, but his ideas certainly had legs. He might not have built bombs, but others could have using his equations. And if the Reich gets a head start on atomic research, the race for the bomb gets darker. The Manhattan Project becomes a desperate counter, not a confident lead. And politically, his presence complicates the Nazi narrative. Here's a Jewish genius too famous to erase. They either suppress him with a high-speed ticket to a death camp, so turning him into a martyr, or co-opt him and try to spin to the Nazi elite that this Jew is okay. But say he's allowed to work quietly, under watch. His theories keep evolving, and Germany becomes the epicenter of physics, which means the best and brightest scientists, students, thinkers. They don't flee to the United States, they stay, or they go east. America's labs lose momentum and Britain's edge dulls. Einstein never wrote to Roosevelt about the potential for nuclear weapons, and that letter doesn't spark the urgency that kicked off the bomb. Without it, development slows or pivots or gets intercepted by spies before it even begins. And the stakes rise significantly. Maybe Germany develops the bomb first, maybe they use it on London, and maybe that's how the war ends. Or perhaps the Allies still win, and Einstein becomes a tragic, hated figure, not a Princeton icon, but a vilified figure in post-war Europe. He might be jailed, exiled late, or forgotten, his name footnoted under layers of propaganda. That evil man who helped the Nazis with the bomb. The post-war world loses more than a face on a poster. It loses a symbol. The wild hair, the grin, the voice calling for peace and civil rights is gone. Einstein, the public conscience of science, just never emerges. The official story of the United States is filled with glory and wild ambition, but there was a horrendous undercurrent of violence, broken treaties, and at times outright genocide towards the native people. From the Atlantic coast to the Pacific, native nations fought back hard, brilliantly, and often, but they were outgunned, outnumbered, and eventually overwhelmed. But what if they hadn't been? What if native resistance hadn't just slowed colonization, but stopped it? Starting from the very early days, tribes don't just resist independently, they coordinate and give the budding colonists a hiding or two that rocks them back. The Iroquois Confederacy, the Powhatan, the Creek, the Lakota, each working together in war and diplomacy. European settlers find united fronts, not fractured ones, and their divide-and-conquer strategies stall almost from the beginning. Colonies struggle to expand, Jamestown falters, Plymouth stays coastal, and westward expansion just never gets off the ground. And because of that, treaties hold real weight, agreements are honored, because the alternative, total defeat, is too costly. Native nations become permanent players in the American region, governing, negotiating, and trading on their terms. The US map looks different from the beginning. Patchworks of sovereign nations, not one sprawling republic with multiple shameful reservations. The idea of manifest destiny never quite takes hold, and the frontier becomes a bridge, not a battleground. Culturally, native knowledge doesn't just survive, it thrives. Languages stay spoken and passed down without fear, while medicinal practices and ecological thinking shape agriculture and land use. The buffalo don't vanish, forests aren't clear-cut, and rivers stay sacred. America grows, but more carefully, more collaboratively, less destructively. And socially, the ripple runs deep. Settlers learn to coexist instead of dominate, they adapt, and mixed communities become the norm. Intermarriage, shared governance, bilingual schools. Perhaps America could have become the first social melting pot that actually worked. Maybe the 25th president of the United States isn't McKinley, but Wahanasata of the Cheyenne tribe. In 1789, Paris bowled over and eventually heads rolled. Bread lines turned into barricades, and centuries of monarchy cracked under the weight of hunger and rage. But what if it hadn't? What if the storming of the Bastille fizzled out, the king held firm, and the revolution never got off the ground? Well, let's start at Versailles, the opulent symbol of the decadent French monarchy. Louis XVI doesn't blink, and maybe the National Assembly gets crushed early, or Lafayette sides with the crown. Either way, The budding revolutionary movement falls flat on its face, and the reformers are jailed or brought kicking and screaming to the guillotine. France stays royal, powdered wigs, outrageous excess, all of that stuff. Because of that, the Ancien regime, the old political and social system, holds firm. The aristocracy keeps its land, and the church maintains its tithes. There's no declaration of the rights of man, and certainly no French Republic. The Enlightenment doesn't die, it definitely stalls though, and that dream of liberty, equality, fraternity is quietly put to one side. It's a nice idea, but it's a nice idea for another time. And that completely reshapes all of Europe. Without the revolution, there would be no Napoleonic Wars, no conscripted armies marching across the continent. Napoleon would remain a general under the king. Monarchies don't scramble to tighten control or reform under pressure. Instead, they stay firm, smug, and untouched. The map doesn't change much, and empires breathe a little easier. In France, the cost runs all the way down. The middle class stays muted, and peasants stay horribly poor. There's no land reform, no civil code, no metric system. The 19th century rolls in, and France looks a lot like it did in the 17th, elegant and puffed up on the surface, but rotting underneath. Further afield, the effects would be dramatic. Haiti wouldn't rise in rebellion, and Latin America wouldn't get its revolutionary spark. The US wouldn't have its ideological ally across the pond, and because of that, democracy's spread would slow to a crawl. Romanticism, an artistic and intellectual movement that originated in Europe towards the end of the 18th century, doesn't burn anywhere nearly as brightly. The arts stay polite and well-formed. Literature doesn't develop its edgier side that appeared during this period, and the fire that drove Beethoven, Hugo, and Goya vanishes. In a sense, Europe remains a continent of the old and never takes the great leap forward. The French Revolution wasn't just a rebellion. It was a blueprint that inspired people across the globe. If it had failed, the world wouldn't just look different, it would feel different. Less volatile, idealistic, and democratic. A world where the people never took the stage. Eventually, as it always does, pressure builds, and maybe France erupts again in 1830 or 1848. But the energy's different. The first revolution got stamped out, but perhaps the second comes with more suspicion, more blood, and less hope. Maybe a full-blown civil war erupts, and hundreds of thousands of lives are lost as a result. Who really knows? China had the raw ingredients for centuries. Rich cities, skilled labor, and a deep tradition of invention. Gunpowder, paper printing, the compass, all Chinese firsts. So what if the big economic explosion, the steam, the coal, the factories, had started in Shanghai, not Sheffield? Well, instead of spinning jennies in England, you've got mechanized silk looms humming in Hangzhou. Instead of British coal mines fueling textile mills, it's Chinese iron fueling railroads across the Yangtze. Urban centers explode, not in Manchester, but in Guangzhou and Suzhou, and the balance of power tips early and hard. Because of that, colonialism flips on its head. It's not European ships docking in Asian ports, it's Chinese fleets patrolling the Indian Ocean, establishing factories and setting terms. Africa and the Americas don't get carved up by Lisbon and London, they bargain with Beijing, and that changes who writes the rules for centuries to come. The world learns Mandarin before English, and Confucian ethics guide global business. Western philosophers respond to Eastern dominance, not the other way around. The Enlightenment doesn't emerge in Europe as a rejection of monarchy, it starts in response to Chinese innovation and trade networks. In Europe, development lags. Without the capital surge from colonies and the edge of industrial mass production, countries like France and England would have stayed agrarian much longer. Their revolutions come later or they don't come at all, while China, flush with invention and trade, sets the template for modern governance, technology, and science. Instead of Britain barging into China, setting up a booming opium trade that savaged the local population, then keeping hold of Hong Kong for 99 years, things play out in reverse. China sets up trading posts along the British coast and begins flooding the country with the drug that everybody loves, but which punches a hole in communities. Maybe they decide that they're going to keep Southampton for a little while. Let's say 99 years. By the time the 20th century rolls around, everything's inverted. The world wars may still happen, but the alliances look different. The US rises, certainly, but it's rising into a Chinese-led order, and communism doesn't begin with Marx, it's debated in Confucian academies. In fact, whether communism would have even taken hold in China if it were already a world leader, that's really questionable. The Cold War, instead of the titanic standoff it became, is just a tense negotiation between new power blocks shaped by centuries of Chinese-led industrial growth. The modern world does feel familiar. Cities, tech, trade, but the fingerprints are different. Skyscrapers are shaped like pagodas and bullet trains named for emperors, and they tear across the world. But when people say developed world, they don't mean the West. They mean the East. Let's say the bullet misses, or Booth gets stopped outside Ford's Theatre. Lincoln lives, wounded maybe, but still standing. Reconstruction doesn't get handed off to Andrew Johnson, it stays in Lincoln's hands. Steady, deliberate. Because of that, the tone shifts. Instead of bitter revenge or half-hearted compromise, the South gets reintegrated under someone who actually wanted unity and not just power. Lincoln pushes for the 14th and 15th Amendments with force, not foot-dragging, and backs the Freedmen's Bureau with real muscle. So when Southern politicians start writing black codes, they're stopped cold. There's a greater degree of public accountability and obviously far less fury. A promise that the New South won't look like the old one with fresh coats of paint. And because the message comes from Lincoln, the same man who freed the slaves and held the Union together, it carries more weight. That doesn't mean everything turns rosy, racism doesn't vanish, and resistance doesn't disappear, but it meets a firmer response. The Klan doesn't rise unchecked. Maybe federal troops stay longer while voting rights come earlier and stick harder. The Great Migration might slow, not because things are perfect, but because the South isn't quite as suffocating. Meanwhile, Lincoln's presence keeps the Republican Party on track and doesn't splinter into factions so fast. Black Americans don't get politically orphaned by the 1880s. There's a chance, a genuine one at that the United States faces its racial history much earlier, with more clarity and less backpedaling. Internationally, the US looks steadier. Lincoln's survival sends a signal that democracy is not fragile, which makes monarchies across Europe a little bit skittish. Movements for equality feel just a little more plausible, and America walks into the industrial age not just powerful, but much more principled, a country that others look to for guidance. Imagine the British Raj without Gandhi. No Salt March, no spinning wheel, no quiet defiance in homespun cloth, just a subcontinent simmering with unrest, but no single figure to channel it. Gandhi wasn't exactly born into the kind of bone-crushing abject poverty that many did in India in 1869, but life was still a delicate balancing act. Disease could still ravage, and the odds of children making it past their 5th birthday were still painfully low. So what if one of the many cholera outbreaks had taken him when he was still young? Without Gandhi, the independence movement might have taken a sharper turn, and leaders like Subhash Chandra Bose, who favored armed resistance, could have risen to prominence. The struggle for freedom might have become more violent, with uprisings and confrontations replacing peaceful protests. The British, facing a more aggressive opposition, might have responded with harsher crackdowns. Martial law, mass arrests, and public executions could have become commonplace. The path to independence might have been bloodier and more prolonged. Gandhi's philosophy of non-violence and civil disobedience not only united diverse groups within India, but also garnered international support. Without his leadership, the movement might have lacked cohesion, and global sympathy for India's cause could have diminished. Communal tensions between Hindus and Muslims might have escalated earlier and more viciously. Gandhi's efforts to promote unity and inclusivity were pivotal in bridging religious divides. Of course, independence would have happened at some point or another. I mean, it had to. There was no way Britain could keep control of an area so vast and diverse. But without Gandhi, the partition of India could have been more chaotic, with increased violence and displacement. And that's saying something, considering the actual partition saw up to 2 million deaths and 14 million people displaced. Internationally, Gandhi's approach inspired civil rights movements around the world. Without his example, figures like Martin Luther King Jr. might have lacked a blueprint for peaceful protest. The global landscape of civil rights could have looked very different indeed. Gandhi's presence didn't just change the course of India's history, it reshaped the world's understanding of resistance and moral leadership. In 1948, the State of Israel came into being, a homeland born from centuries of exile, fresh wounds from the Holocaust, and a political tug-of-war that pulled a new country into place. But what if it hadn't happened? What if the UN vote failed, the British never left, and the idea of a Jewish state got shelved for something less explosive? The first thing that changes, of course, is the map. There's no partition, no fight of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, and no immediate war with Arab neighbors. The Middle East is still volatile, it always is, but the powder keg has one less fuse, which means lines stay blurred, but they don't bleed just yet. It also means Jewish survivors scatter differently. Instead of rallying around Tel Aviv, they head to New York, London, Buenos Aires, wherever the borders stay open. The Zionist dream becomes something quieter, still discussed, still yearned for, but not anchored to a piece of land, while Judaism continues as a global identity, strong, vibrant, but completely stateless. Because of that, US foreign policy looks different. Without Israel as a Cold War ally, American relationships in the Arab world stay friendlier, more oil deals, fewer embassies under siege. In Europe, the legacy of the Holocaust moves in new directions. There's no Israeli refuge to point to, no place to say never again with a flag. Jewish life in Europe might grow again, or it might vanish further under the weight of fear and memory. Over time, the consequences really begin to stack up. No Six-Day War, no intifadas, no Oslo Accords or West Bank headlines. The conflict that defined so much of the 20th century becomes a void, and that void is filled with different crises, different arguments, and entirely different maps. And what about the people? Palestinians don't live in exile or under occupation, and Israelis don't grow up in a country surrounded by enemies. Diaspora Jews don't have a homeland to defend or question, and the entire debate from college campuses to UN chambers simply never exists. The world keeps spinning, and because we're a slightly simple species who only really learn from lessons, maybe this whole situation erupts in a different place. You see, Palestine was one of a number of proposed areas for a potential Zionist state, with some of the others being Uganda, Argentina, Cyprus, Mozambique, the Sinai Peninsula, and Australia. Imagine if they'd picked Uganda. It was the 1940s, and much of Africa was still under colonial rule, so maybe Britain decides a large chunk of its land north of Lake Victoria can be used to create a new Jewish state. They don't really mind. It's not like they use the area for much, and maybe Israel can pay a fee over the next 50 years or so. We've now got modern Israel set up in the heart of Africa, and who knows how that would play out. It's one of the darkest chapters in human history. 6 million Jews murdered systematically alongside millions of others. But what if it never happened? What if Hitler never seized power? Or if someone stopped him before the trains rolled and the camps filled? Well, let's start in Germany. Say the Nazi Party stalls out, maybe the economy recovers just fast enough, or the failed coup in 1923 ruins Hitler's credibility for good. Anti-Semitism doesn't vanish, but it doesn't become state policy either. The Weimar Republic limps on, fragile but intact, and democracy in Germany doesn't get drowned in jackboots and demented methamphetamine screeching. Because of that, millions live, and Jewish families across Europe grow up in their homes, not hiding or fleeing. Writers, scientists, shopkeepers, rabbis, they don't become names or memorials. Instead, they become grandparents, teachers, mentors. Whole communities thrive instead of being erased. And the war? It might still happen. Hitler wasn't the only fascist in town. I'm looking at you, Spain, Italy, and Portugal. But maybe when it breaks out, it's smaller, it's less genocidal, it's more contained. And the war crimes tribunals, the refugee crisis, the sheer psychic scar across a continent, all of that softens. Europe still suffers, but it heals faster. I mean, so far, so good, but ripple effects, really hard to predict. The modern idea of human rights, the one built on the ashes of Auschwitz, takes longer to form. There's no Nuremberg trial to highlight the idea of crimes against humanity, no universal horror to push the UN into drafting new laws, and the word genocide is never created, despite the fact that it had already happened countless times before. Israel doesn't get the moral push that followed the Holocaust, and its creation becomes harder to justify internationally, meaning Jewish migration continues to scatter instead of converge. That changes the Middle East, it changes America, it changes just about everything. If the Holocaust hadn't been prevented, we wouldn't celebrate that fact. There'd be no memorials, no anniversaries, no survivors sharing warnings. It would just be history, quietly avoided, an abyss that never opens. And maybe that's the most human twist of all. The best version of the past is the one we don't remember because we didn't need to. If you want to turn it on its head and dive into the negative quagmire, and why not? We've got time. You could argue that part of the reason the second half of the 20th century has been so peaceful was because of the horror born out of World War II and the Holocaust. Remember, there were 21 years between the First and Second World Wars. We obviously didn't learn very much. So now imagine we go back for more sometime in the 1970s. The end of the terrible trilogy. In America, slavery didn't just end, it exploded. A bloody civil war, 600,000 dead, and generations of bitterness etched into the country's DNA. But what if it hadn't gone that way? What if, somehow, slavery had ended without war, without bullets, bayonets, or burning cities? Let's say the abolition movement catches fire earlier in the North, not just morally, but economically. Cotton prices drop, industrialization shifts gears, and public sentiment hardens. Southern leaders, staring down declining profits and rising pressure, start negotiating rather than digging in. Maybe there's a gradual emancipation deal, compensation for slaveholders, education plans for freed people, and federal support to ease the transition. Because of that, the country avoids war. There's no Sherman's March, no Gettysburg, no Andersonville. Cities don't burn, families don't splinter under draft riots, and the South isn't turned into rubble. The blood cost drops to near zero, but the moral weight? That's where things get slippery. Without war, there's no Emancipation Proclamation, no Lincoln martyrdom, no seismic reckoning that forced the nation to stare at itself and say, this ends now. Slavery fades out, but so does urgency. Racism doesn't die, it just changes its clothes. Freed black Americans might get more initial stability, land grant schools a real start, but without Reconstruction, there's no push to redefine citizenship. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, the Reconstruction Amendments that expanded civil rights, come slower or they just don't come at all. Rights arrive in inches, not leaps. It could have been a painfully long process. Meanwhile, Southern elites keep their power, but rebrand from slaveholders to landlords, locking freed people into debt instead of chains. Jim Crow still slithers in, just with less backlash because there's no war guild to challenge it. Civil rights fights start earlier, maybe, but they hit the same walls. The absence of war means fewer scars and fewer stories, no epic battles, no haunting photographs of fields turning red. The moral clarity that comes from beating each other to near death for 4 years with very little to show for it never solidifies, and America's conscience stays foggier. The South doesn't get rebuilt because it never breaks, which means no wave of northern politicians reshaping Southern law, no Freedmen's Bureau, no radical Republicans, just a slow, grinding shift. You see, it's often tempting to imagine a bloodless end as better, cleaner, kinder, but sometimes rupture is the only thing that wakes a system up. In 1947, British lawyer Sir Cyril Radcliffe arrived in India tasked with the impossible, drawing a line that would separate predominantly Hindu India from newly formed and predominantly Muslim Pakistan. To be completely fair, Radcliffe did his best, but the execution of the subsequent partition was nightmarish. One midnight promise of freedom for two nations, carved hastily by a line that didn't just divide land, but hearts, histories, and homes. Millions dead. 14 million heading in either direction, looking for a new home. But what if that line was never drawn? What if India didn't fracture? Let's start with the first days. The British leave, but instead of fleeing a riotous exit, they hand over a single country, not two. There is no Pakistan, there's no border slicing through Punjab or Bengal. Gandhi's dream lives a little longer. Maybe Nehru and Jinnah find a way to share power. Perhaps the centre holds. Because of that, the violence doesn't explode, and there are no trains filled with corpses, no villages lit on fire for praying the wrong way, and the largest mass migration in human history never happens. Families stay put, cities don't get emptied and repopulated overnight. Trauma does still exist, but it's not burned into the DNA of two nations. And that changes everything. No India-Pakistan wars, no race for nukes. Kashmir is still complicated, but maybe not militarized. Maybe it's a negotiation and not a battlefield. With defense budgets slashed, money flows into schools, hospitals, and roads. The region doesn't just avoid bloodshed, it gets a jump start on progress. Culturally, the fabric doesn't tear and shred. Bollywood sings to everyone, and cricket is just a game, it's not a proxy war. Families visit relatives across provinces while migration still happens, but it's about work, not survival. Globally, the subcontinent speaks with one voice. A united India carries more weight at the UN, the G20, and every summit in between. The Cold War runs differently when one of the world's biggest populations isn't split down the middle. Suddenly, everything sounds really nice, but let's be honest, unity does not mean peace. The region's too diverse, too passionate, too big for harmony all the time. Religious tension still simmers and power still gets contested. But instead of border skirmishes and arms races, those fights play out in parliament, in courts, and in elections. The darker possibility hanging over this is that some kind of war between the two sides would have become inevitable. Maybe Pakistan's independent movement emerged after the British left, and India put it down with ruthless violence. Had the partition not happened, India would have gone one of two ways, either a culturally and socially diverse country living in shaky peace, or down a dark road that perhaps leads to something akin to a partition anyway. In 1950, Korea was split in half, north and south, divided by ideology and war. But what if that crack sealed instead? What if the war ended not in an armistice but in unification? First, the fighting ends fast. Maybe the UN pushes harder, or maybe China stays out. The South, backed by the West, retakes the peninsula and plants one flag over Seoul and Pyongyang. The war ends in 1951, not in a stalemate, but in a surprising sweeping victory. And because of that, there's no DMZ, no 38th parallel lined with mines and watchtowers. Instead, Korea moves forward as one country, scarred but rebuilding. The economy isn't split, families aren't torn apart for decades. A generation doesn't grow up on opposite sides of a barbed wire line. Northern traditions don't vanish, they blend. Pyongyang's architecture stands next to Seoul's skyscrapers. Folk songs from the mountains meet K-pop before it even exists. The identity isn't fractured, it's simply layered. Economically, things shift quickly. Resources from the north, coal, minerals, energy, pair with the south's budding tech and trade. By the 80s, Korea was a powerhouse, not just a miracle, but a movement that rivaled the other Asian giant at the time, Japan. Samsung still rises, but so does steel from the former north. Growth spreads more evenly, and fewer people are left behind. Politically, the implications are massive. No nuclear threats from Pyongyang, no brinkmanship every time a missile test goes wrong. The US still keeps a presence in Asia, but without the Korean powder keg, diplomacy in the region softens. China's rise meets a stronger, unified Korea, not a divided one playing defense. Globally, Korea becomes a bridge, not a flashpoint. It mediates, connects, and influences. Asia has a completely different power now that they don't have to spend so much time, money, and energy watching each other. Of course, unification wouldn't erase every tension. The scars of war don't fade cleanly, and power struggles still happen, as does corruption. But the country moves together, not apart. And in doing so, it rewrites the story of the Cold War, not as a line drawn through a nation, but one that got healed. In the late 1990s, Osama bin Laden wasn't yet a household name. He was wanted, he was watched, he was dangerously underestimated. But what if one of those early chances to nab him had actually worked? What if US forces had caught him before the towers fell? Well, let's start with 1998. The embassy bombings in Kenya and Tanzania had just happened. There were cruise missiles, missed targets, and shaky intelligence. But imagine that they got it right. Bin Laden was captured, shackled, and flown out of Afghanistan before most Americans could even pronounce his name. Because of that, 9/11 doesn't happen. The plot, already in motion, loses its head as cells get disrupted and communication breaks down. Some version of the plan might still form, but not that day, not those planes, not that scale. America doesn't wake up to the worst terrorist attack in its history. And that means no war on terror, no invasion of Afghanistan, no Iraq war built on sketchy theories about Saddam hoarding chemical weapons out in the desert somewhere. Thousands of lives are not lost. Trillions of dollars are not spent. The US military doesn't get bogged down in 2 decades of warfare. Bush's presidency doesn't pivot toward war because, well, there is no war, and the Patriot Act isn't passed in a rush. Airport security stays irritating, but it's not Orwellian. Islamophobia doesn't spike overnight. A generation doesn't grow up under the shadow of terror alerts and color-coded threat levels. Globally, the Middle East looks different. Without the invasion of Iraq, there would be no power vacuum, no rise of ISIS. Syria still struggles, but the firestorm that followed bin Laden's attacks never gets lit. Refugee crises are smaller. Global instability doesn't ripple as wide. And what about bin Laden? He doesn't become a martyr. He just becomes a name on a docket, a face behind bars, maybe even tried in an international court, a slight embarrassment for the Saudi royal family, but nothing more than that. It wouldn't fix everything, though. Extremism doesn't just vanish and terror just doesn't end, but lop off the head of the most vicious lead viper and it changes trajectory, meaning a version of the 21st century that starts with fewer scars and fewer graves. All because someone kicked down the right door in time. Colonialism didn't just extract resources, it rewrote borders, languages, and futures. But what if it ended early, say in the mid-1800s? What if instead of clinging to colonies, the European powers packed up, paid reparations, and just left? First, the shock would be global. Empires like Britain, France, Belgium, and Portugal would pull out of Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean before the scramble even hits full speed. There would be no Berlin Conference, no partition maps drawn with rulers, and indigenous leaders would get the pen instead of the boot. Because of that, nations evolve on their own timelines, with institutions growing from the ground up. Schools teach local histories, while parliaments debate local priorities. The grip of imposed religion, foreign laws, and imported bureaucracy loosens, and the 19th century becomes one of internal reform, not external domination. The economic changes are perhaps among the biggest. Resources aren't funneled to European capitals. Instead, they stay local, feeding domestic industry, not greedy imperial bellies. Railroads and ports, they still get built, but they serve people, not just exports. Poverty doesn't vanish, but it's not neatly baked into a global hierarchy. That kind of autonomy reshapes global politics. Without colonization, resistance movements don't harden into revolution, and the Cold War doesn't have proxy battlegrounds across the global south. Countries like Congo, India, and Indonesia don't get caught between Moscow and Washington. They chart their own strange, flawed, independent paths. Immigration patterns change, too. Without centuries of colonial entanglement, diaspora communities look different. Migration still happens for work and opportunity, but it's less shaped by conquest and fallout. Cultural exchange becomes something chosen. It's not inherited from occupation. Whole generations don't grow up taught that their history started with someone else's flag. Identity gets built with fewer fractures. Pride doesn't have to be reclaimed. It was just never stripped away in the first place. It wouldn't be utopia, and maybe several civil wars will still bleed nations dry, but it sets them on the path much earlier. Imagine if, back in 1980, someone in a Washington office with real decision-making power and not just a business card had glanced away from the Cold War briefings long enough to notice what was quietly taking root in American cities. Picture that person not just noticing, but actually giving a shit. What if, instead of waiting for the inevitable panic, they'd asked the right questions early? Why is cocaine suddenly affordable for teenagers? Why is it morphing into something smokable, faster-acting, and devastatingly addictive? And more importantly, why is it spreading through the very neighborhoods we've systematically underfunded, overpoliced, and politically ignored? Suppose the first wave of crack users had been met not with helicopters and battering rams, but with outreach, detox beds, and a little empathy. It's dangerously radical, I know. Imagine we treated addiction as a medical emergency, not a public nuisance, as something to treat, not punish, as something that needed funding, not firepower. It would have meant fewer children watching their parents get hauled off in handcuffs, fewer families torn apart not just by addiction, but by mandatory minimums that outlasted the drugs themselves. Instead of seeing an opportunity to posture as tough on crime, maybe lawmakers would have taken a tougher stance on poverty, housing inequality, and unemployment, the conditions that made the epidemic spread like wildfire in the first place. Of course, this assumes that they actually wanted to solve the problem and not just manage it in a way that kept certain people in power and others permanently marked as criminals. After all, crack wasn't the first drug crisis in America. It was just the first one that made it politically convenient to declare war on an entire demographic. I mean, think about it. Cocaine stayed glamorous and powdery and mostly legal adjacent as long as it stayed on Wall Street and in country clubs. It only became an epidemic when it hit Harlem and Compton, and only then did Congress discover an urgent need for sweeping legislation conveniently written to punish crack users 100 times harder than anyone snorting from a gold-plated mirror in Manhattan. So what if instead there had been equality in response? What if the neighborhoods hardest hit were flooded with social workers instead of SWAT? What if the media hadn't leaned into scare stories about crack babies and instead focused on the complete lack of support for pregnant women in crisis? Maybe the prison population wouldn't have quadrupled. Maybe entire communities would have been hollowed out and rebranded as high crime zones, which somehow always meant places where black people live. And maybe, just maybe, we'd have learned to separate policy from punishment. Stopping it early wouldn't have meant stopping all drug use forever, but it could have meant stopping the damage from metastasizing into something that still lingers today, in sentencing laws, in policing patterns, and in public memory that too often forgets who got hurt and who walked away with a campaign ad. It's early 2020. A strange pneumonia is spreading in Wuhan, but in this timeline, the response is fast, decisive, and brutally effective. Local officials don't suppress the truth. Instead, they escalate it. Within days, Wuhan locks down before the Lunar New Year migration. Travel halts, borders tighten, international flights are cancelled. The virus, still finding its legs, is trapped. At the same time, Chinese scientists release the genome, and global health agencies act quickly. South Korea, Taiwan, and Singapore roll out testing and contact tracing before the virus crosses their borders. Europe follows suit. Even the US, often slow to respond, shuts down major entry points and launches an aggressive containment campaign. The outbreak fizzles. It becomes a localized crisis, not a global catastrophe. The headlines fade by spring. In this alternate 2020, there are no makeshift hospitals in Central Park, no refrigerated trucks parked behind hospitals in Queens, and no last goodbyes over video calls. Children keep going to school. Grandparents keep hugging their grandkids. Offices never close. Zoom stays just another niche business app. The Tokyo Olympics go ahead, and the wedding industry booms. Holiday plans remain untouched. There's no global recession, no supply chain collapse, no wave of evictions or record unemployment. While markets do still wobble, they recover quickly. Politics, untouched by the stress test of a pandemic, flows down different tracks. Trump campaigns without COVID dominating the airwaves, and conspiracy theories never find the fertile ground of global chaos. Yet, for all its relief, this version of history can easily veer towards disaster. Without the drama, there's no urgency that has led to greater thinking about the potential for another even greater outbreak. Without COVID-19, there's no focus. In China, wet markets reopen quietly and remain unchanged. The funding dries up, the interest fades. And then, perhaps, bang, a new virus roars across the world, perhaps faster, deadlier, and better adapted to humans. It catches everybody off guard. There's no practice run, there's no scar tissue, no urgency driving collaboration between governments and scientists. This time, the death toll could be far worse, and the response far slower. So while this alternate timeline spares us grief in the short term, it also leaves us vulnerable in the long run. Millions live who might not have, but millions more in the future pay the price. Of course, there are debates about where it came from and how, but that doesn't matter much. We experienced a mild pandemic compared to how bad things can get, and plenty has certainly been done behind the scenes regarding a potential future outbreak. COVID was bad, but if you had a choice of plague, Ebola, or COVID-19 as a taster pandemic, I think we'll all go for the latter. After World War II, Europe was in pieces. Cities burned, economies collapsed, borders blurred under rubble and ration lines. The US stepped in with the Marshall Plan, a mountain of money, $13 billion, that's around $150 billion today, to rebuild Western Europe and keep communism from sneaking in through the cracks. The Marshall Plan did a few things. It increased US power in the region, and while they didn't make money on the deal per se, the knock-on effects regarding indirect financial benefits were enormous. But what if the offer had gone further? The Soviet Union was actually offered the Marshall Plan money, but Stalin, being the arrogant and possibly borderline insane mass murderer that he was, he said no. So what if the Soviet bloc had said yes, and Washington hadn't blinked? Let's start in Eastern Europe. Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, instead of slipping behind the Iron Curtain, they get steel, grain, cement, and credit. Not just survival, they get momentum. Power grids come online, roads get patched, factories hum again. Not because of 5-year plans, but thanks to American cash and imported machinery. That alone dramatically alters the system. Central planning loses its grip before it can sink in. Moscow can't ration loyalty through scarcity if people already have food, lights, and decent jobs. Leaders don't need to crush dissent with tanks if they can point to working plumbing and say, see, it's getting better. The catch, of course, is that it wasn't their system making it happen. And once people know that, ideology doesn't hold like it used to. You can't sell communism as salvation when its Western capital are rebuilding the bridges and clearing the rubble. The East-West divide doesn't vanish overnight, but it does soften. Maybe barbed wire never goes up, but maybe border guards get replaced with customs booths and student exchange programs. Trade grows, paranoia shrinks, and the Cold War starts to sound less like a standoff and more like an awkward conversation between a newly divorced couple. Inside the Soviet Union, the pressure changes shape. Stalin loses one of his sharpest tools, isolation. People start hearing what's happening in Prague, Warsaw, and Budapest. They hear about cars, coffee, and supermarket shelves that don't sit empty for months. The myth starts cracking. In the US, the move is not popular. Some politicians scream about handing money to communists, and no doubt taxpayers grumble. But in the long term, America stops looking like a distant empire and starts looking like a builder, not just a superpower, but a super partner. It's diplomacy by the dollar sign. And it works. By the 1970s, the map starts to look strange. If it even exists, the Warsaw Pact functions more like a regional trade club than a military threat. No Berlin Wall, no exodus. People don't try to flee what's already improving. If the trend holds, reform doesn't come through revolts or collapses. It comes quietly through contracts, shipping lanes, and cross-border bank accounts. By the 1990s, the Cold War didn't end with a bang. It ended with paperwork. Extending the Marshall Plan east wouldn't have fixed everything, but it might have meant fewer fences, less fear, and a Europe rebuilding itself on common ground instead of split loyalties and concrete walls. Oh, dick. It could have all been so different. The moment Nixon hit record, he did more than save a copy of his own downfall. He served it up on a plate. Those tapes didn't just confirm corruption, they stripped away the denials and made the lies mechanical, magnetic, and replayable in court. But suppose the reels had mysteriously disappeared before anybody thought to ask for them. The Watergate break-in still happens, and the cover-up kicks off the same way. But without those tapes, it's not a scandal with a climax, it's a slow mess of suspicion, crossed wires, and legal fog. Nixon denies it, his aides close rank, but the story loses its punch and the outrage loses traction. Congress gets smoke, but not fire. The hearings drag, the public stays split, half of them angry, half of them numb. And in that space, Nixon holds the line. No resignation, no helicopter, just a man behind a desk, hoping the headlines get bored before the subpoenas land. That changes the future, not just for Nixon, but for the office itself. Every president after learns the same lesson. Don't record it, don't write it down, and for God's sake, don't say it near a mic. Scandal becomes a choreography of denial. The truth still matters, it's just harder to prove. The press keeps digging, but without a tape, there's no moment that cuts through the noise. Watergate becomes a half story, not a turning point. There's no gate for future disasters to borrow. Ford never steps into the presidency. There's no pardon, no national healing tour, no Sunday editorials about restoring trust. Vietnam continues under Nixon's hand, as does the Cold War, but the moral line, no one is above the law, never materializes, or it does so later. By the time the 1980s arrive, scandal blends into the wallpaper. Political damage becomes something you manage, not something you pay for. Nixon is remembered not as disgraced, but as resilient. The takeaway from the whole sorry saga isn't tell the truth, it's don't leave proof. In 1868, Japan flipped the script. Out went the shoguns, in came the emperor, and with him, railroads, factories, and modern warfare. But what if that shift never happened? What if the Meiji Restoration never took off, and Japan stayed stuck in its old rhythms? Let's start with the obvious. Japan stays closed. No steamships pulling into Tokyo Bay, no top-down race to westernize. The samurai class holds power. Rigid social tiers remain locked, and industrialization doesn't get a head start. Because of that, the country doesn't become a rival, it becomes a relic, and that changes the region overnight. Without a modern navy or conscript army, Japan can't take on China or Russia, which means no war victories, no empire, no annexation of Korea or Taiwan. Instead of flexing, Japan stays cautious, trading a rising sun for a fading, slightly sad lantern. Internally, things stagnate, education doesn't boom, and the press doesn't spread. Science and engineering don't get their spotlight. The Western world races forward with railroads and medicine, while Japan holds fast to rituals and robes. It's not a bad life, but it is a quieter one, with less momentum and more missed trains. More tea ceremonies, fewer used female knickers in vending machines. And globally, Japan never becomes that wild card. It doesn't shock the world by defeating Russia in 1905 or challenge the US at Pearl Harbor. World War II, at least in the Pacific, plays out entirely differently, or maybe not at all. Without Japan in the mix, the US doesn't drop the bomb. The Cold War boundaries shift, history moves, but on a different track. Japan's not bombed into the previous century. That's good, but it also means no massive American development that took them from ashes to one of the world's biggest economies in just a matter of decades. The global obsession with Japanese tech, cars, and pop culture never takes root. No Sony, no Nintendo, no Studio Ghibli. Instead of exporting cultural icons, Japan remains an exotic footnote known for its past, not its future. Eventually, though, pressure builds. The rural poor want change, and the young want opportunity. Other Asian nations start modernizing without them, and at some point, Japan would have to adapt. But without the urgency or vision of the Meiji leaders, the shift would be slow, patchy, maybe even violent. The Meiji Restoration didn't just modernize Japan, it rewired its destiny. I mean, you take it away, and the country doesn't collapse, but it kind of just fades quietly. While the rest of the world is building skyscrapers and superhighways, Japan might still be bowing in castles, respected but left behind, until the shock realization that they desperately need to catch up. In 1929, the bottom fell out. Markets crashed, banks folded, and the world economy spiraled into the worst downturn in modern history. But what if it didn't? What if smarter regulation, calmer investors, or a better timed intervention kept the crash from becoming a full-blown catastrophe? First off, the roaring 20s don't end in ashes. Stock prices still dip, they have to, but they don't nosedive. That means no mass panic, bread lines wrapping around city blocks, or the Dust Bowl exodus choking highways west. People tighten belts certainly, but they don't lose everything overnight. Because of that, governments stay steadier. FDR didn't need to roll out the New Deal with the same urgency because there were no Hoovervilles, those sad shanty towns that symbolize the period. Unions still rose, but they did it through pressure, not despair. And America, instead of spending a decade crawling through misery, stumbled and then walked it off. Globally, the impact's massive. Hitler doesn't get his platform of economic rage, and the Nazi Party, still fringe, doesn't gain power from broken promises and starving crowds. Maybe he fades into obscurity or never runs at all. The same goes for fascist movements in Italy and Spain. Without mass unemployment, the slogans don't stick as well. Meanwhile, Imperial Japan doesn't lash out for resources because it isn't locked out of global markets by the Depression-era trade wars. That means fewer invasions, less blood in Manchuria, and maybe, just maybe, no war in the Pacific. The cascade of violence leading to World War II looks more like a slow drip. At home, the long-term ripple is interesting. Without the Depression, there would be less push for massive federal oversight. Maybe Social Security is delayed, banking reforms are much lighter or not at all, and the American state doesn't expand nearly as fast or as far. Politically, the shift toward big government never quite finds the same fuel. No Grapes of Wrath, no Woody Guthrie songs about dust and struggle. The arts still grow, but without the same bite. Hope never gets tested the same way. And that changes the stories people tell. Even the Cold War takes on a different shade. Without the Depression to discredit capitalism for so many, communism wouldn't have shone as brightly in contrast. The ideological battle that follows World War II feels less stark and more about debate than clash. Overall, avoiding the Great Depression wouldn't have fixed everything. In fact, without the banking reforms, it could have been a case of bigwig greed growing even further and even hungrier, and who knows what could have happened then. Add on another 10 or 20 years, maybe the Great Depression is nothing compared to the gargantuan depression that tore the world apart in the 1940s. We just don't know. When HIV emerged in the early 1980s, it wasn't met with urgency, it was met with silence. Politicians shrugged, the press looked away, and too many doctors turned their backs. But what if they hadn't? What if the world had treated the AIDS crisis like a real crisis from the start? Say, researchers get funding early, not years too late. But months in, public health warnings hit the airwaves before the virus hits critical mass, and instead of being dismissed as someone else's problem, it's treated like what it truly was, a global emergency. That one shift changes everything. People start testing sooner, and stigma doesn't harden into law. Fear doesn't metastasize into hate, while schools teach prevention before funerals become common, and most of all, the death toll doesn't climb into the tens of millions. Meanwhile, the activist energy that finally broke through it in the 1980s kicks in earlier. ACT UP doesn't have to scream just to be seen, it organizes for policy, not just for survival. That pressure speeds up drug development, antiretrovirals hit the market faster, and people who would have died in their 20s start living to old age. You don't lose an entire generation of artists, dancers, teachers, neighbors. The creative force that was gutted in the 80s stays alive, reshaping film, music, and literature. Broadway sounds different, cinema looks different. The entire emotional tone of the decade shifts. Less elegy, more evolution. In the US, Reagan can't dodge the crisis if it starts under his nose. That means earlier acknowledgement, not a press conference years too late. LGBTQ rights might accelerate faster, not because the bigots vanish, but because the human cost becomes impossible to ignore. Globally, the benefits ripple out. Africa, Southeast Asia, South America, places hit hardest by delayed action, get support before infection rates skyrocket. Treatment's not a luxury, it's a given. Generations aren't lost before help arrives. AIDS deaths reached their peak in 2004 with 2.1 million dead. But would it have ever reached that figure if politicians had got off their asses earlier and actually done something about it? Would HIV still exist? Yeah, sure. But it wouldn't have become a symbol of neglect, cruelty, and delay. It would have been what it should have been from day one. A virus, not a death sentence. And maybe, just maybe, we would have learned how to face the next crisis before it hit. In 1965, the US was still standing at the edge. Troops were arriving, but the full escalation hadn't happened yet. The draft hadn't swallowed a generation, and the Vietnamese jungle hadn't become a graveyard. So what if, right then, someone pulled the plug? Say Johnson calls it. Maybe he listens to the skeptics. Perhaps he reads the mood. Either way, the US steps back, not in defeat, but in refusal. South Vietnam's fate is left to its own people, and the American war machine doesn't crank into high gear. That choice shifts the timeline hard. No 500,000 troops, no napalm burning villages, no nightly news broadcasting body counts, no Tet Offensive, because the war never reaches that boiling point. The conflict simmers, maybe still brutal, but it stays local. Domestically, the anti-war movement still exists, but it doesn't explode in rage. Kent State, where the National Guard opened fire on protesters, killing 4 doesn't happen. Trust in government doesn't collapse so spectacularly. The 60s still rebel, but the mood is different. There's fewer funerals, less fury, more room to breathe. Nixon doesn't run on a secret plan to end the war that never fully started. Watergate still unfolds, but in a different light, with fewer bodies buried beneath the lies. The Democratic Party doesn't fracture so deeply, and the entire shape of the 70s might bend toward a different kind of disillusionment. Abroad, the US looks less imperial, less desperate to prove itself through distant jungles. That changes how it walks into other conflicts. Cambodia doesn't get bombed into chaos, Laos doesn't become the most bombed country on earth, and Southeast Asia, while far from peaceful, avoids becoming a Cold War battleground soaked in foreign blood. More than anything, the US keeps something it lost in Vietnam, its moral footing, or at least it keeps the chance to lose it more slowly. The domino theory doesn't vanish, but it gets questioned earlier. The American people don't swallow 10 more years of false hope and empty speeches. When guns went silent in 1918, the world was desperate for a way to keep them silent. So, the League of Nations was born with high hopes, big promises, and a charter signed with idealism. It was a pretty spectacular failure, but what if it had worked? Imagine a version where the US joins from day one. Woodrow Wilson doesn't get sidelined at home, Congress approves, and suddenly the League isn't just a European experiment, it's global and it's got teeth. This means that when Japan invades Manchuria in 1931, the League doesn't just send a sternly worded letter, it imposes sanctions that stick. Japan thinks twice, or at least slows down. When Mussolini eyes Ethiopia, the League blocks arms shipments and chokes off oil. Fascism still rises, but it has to fight harder for breath. With a functioning League, instead of the sad, impotent gang that was left, maybe Versailles would be revised before resentment explodes in Germany. Maybe Hitler never rides that anger into power, or if he does, he's checked earlier, not appeased. Meanwhile, smaller countries actually matter. Borders don't get redrawn with bayonets. Independence movements have somewhere to turn. The idea of collective security starts to mean something. International law isn't a punchline, it's a process that actually works. It's clunky, but it's real. Even the Holocaust might play out differently. Refugees have more places to go. Genocide warnings get heard, not buried. And by the time war does break out, if it breaks out at all, it's with a global coalition already primed to act, not scrambling to wake up. Post-war institutions shift too. Maybe there's no need for a UN because the League simply evolves. No veto power, no Cold War gridlock, just decades of slow, imperfect, but steady cooperation. Climate action, human rights, disarmament, all get a jumpstart by generations. Would peace reign forever? I mean, well, no, obviously not. Nations still act in self-interest, but the difference is this. There's a table. People sit there. They argue. They agree to rules. Sometimes they even follow them. It would be like having a properly functioning UN. I mean, imagine that. Imagine logging on and getting nothing. No likes, no retweets, no endless scroll informing you that you're falling behind on outrage memes or someone else's carefully curated happiness, because in this version of history, social media never happens. No Facebook, no Twitter, no Instagram, just silence where the noise should be. Sounds weird, right? But maybe it was just one area we just never thought to explore. Perhaps we were content to use the internet primarily as a research tool rather than communication or for distraction. Let's start with the obvious. Less dopamine, less data. Without the apps, your phone is a tool, it's not an appendage. There's no algorithm nudging you into conspiracy theories at 2 a.m., no feed boiling every thought down to a hot take or a side to pick. Opinions still spread, they just spread slower. Elections change with no vital campaigns or weaponized outrage masquerading as community. Disinformation, it still exists. Governments have lied forever, but it's handed out like leaflets, not injected into your timeline. Russia doesn't need bots. The US doesn't need shadow bans. Cambridge Analytica never gets an inbox full of your aunt's personality quiz results. Movements shift too. The Arab Spring started much slower. Black Lives Matter still rises, but through organizing, not hashtags. Activism doesn't vanish. It just goes back to paper flyers, kitchen meetings, and cops watching from across the street instead of across the cloud. Mental health is also very different. There's still insecurity, loneliness, and pressure, but without the constant mirror of everyone else's best angle. Teenagers don't measure their worth by engagement rates. Adults don't spiral after comparing their rainy Tuesday morning to someone's vacation film reel from Santorini. For politicians, the game is slower. No instant polling via outrage, no midnight threads trying to rewrite policy history. Scandal takes longer to break, but so does spin. It's harder to go viral, but it's also harder to lie and run. And yet, it's not all peace and analog purity. Without social media, some things stay hidden longer. Abuse, corruption, racism, none of this just vanishes. They just lose one of the loudest microphones ever built. The gatekeepers keep their keys. The walls stay up a little bit longer. But the trade-off is more breathing room and certainly much more privacy. Fewer digital footprints follow you around. You still get fired for bad behavior, but maybe not for a tweet that you made in 2009. So what if social media had never been invented? Well, you still get connections, you still get chaos, but it may move slower, cut shallower, and it doesn't wake you up at 3 a.m. with a stranger's opinion about your haircut. And that is our 50. Thank you for watching.